If you want to preserve your power indefinitely, you have to get the consent of the ruled.
To change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process. Most of it is done by Americans to Americans, thanks to lack of moral standards. As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore.
Wait a minute, what is this thing called group? Where is a group? Can you point to a group? Can you see a group? And you can't. You can only see individuals. The word group is an abstraction. It's like the word forest. There's no such thing as a forest. There are only trees. Sure. You can see trees, but you cannot see forests. So it's an abstraction. When you then, therefore, base a political philosophy on an abstraction, and you say that this abstraction has rights that are greater than the individual, you've made a huge mistake, because what you're doing is you're sacrificing this so-called group anyway, but you're doing it one person at a time. And the irony of it is that the leaders of this so-called democracy, or this concept of collectivism, of the superiority of the group, the leaders are making the decisions of what is best for the greater number.
Well, what is it about the government? Are they morally superior to us, that they can lie with impunity, lie with the law behind them, and if one of us would presume to do it to them, we could end up in jail? The government has institutionalized lying.
Hello and welcome to Health Revealed Part 3, talking more about this idea of statism and how we navigate the medical and political system for a better future overall. This is quite timeless information, considering that we're looking at the psychological insights of this phenomenon that we see is not commonly spoken about in both medical and political fields and social fields. So let's talk more about this with something that is particularly well known, as there was a video that went viral talking about mass psychosis. A video online by After School got several million views, and there's a lot of people talking about this idea ever since that happened, because there was a lot of recent events in history that prompted people to question things. Well, here's a summary of the video. The problem is our inability to deal with ourselves. We are our own worst enemies. Mass psychosis is when a large portion of society loses touch with reality and descends into delusions. Fear feeds this. Delusions help individuals attempt to escape negative emotions, such as fear. It is also built upon confusion. The rulers assume godlike status. The ruled assume childlike status. Both are under delusion. And there is an assumption that it starts in the ruling class in this video. But we might see this as wrong or incomplete based on our study of statism, because in this video, they never mention statism. They're talking about the ruled versus the ruled. They're talking about their mindsets, but not necessarily what that idea of authority does within itself. So I'm joined here by Stephanie Mo Davis, Leslie Powers, Scott Gordon. Thank you very much for joining me here for this awesome conversation. Have you guys heard of mass psychosis, and what are your thoughts on it?
I've heard of it, and it's somewhat controversial because it tends to evade the question of who planned it, who implemented it, who coordinated it, and by it I mean the situation in which the psychosis is around. I do admit that society is going to react, and that reaction can look like psychosis, and so in that sense they've captured that pretty well. So it's a controversial theory. I tend to side with those people who object to it, that they have let the perpetrators off the hook, and that's a really good argument against it. However, psychosis is real, and mass psychosis is real, and it's helpful to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
One might understand the concept through researching mind control or psychological operation and propaganda. which is essentially what psychological operations are, which is a very real thing that the military has engaged in. And these are some of the causal factors behind the scene that sets a stage for the common group, the people in the group to react and then become emotional and through their fear make assumptions and follow the authorities' main message.
Mm. Yeah, this relates to what we talked about before, ideological subversion, right? Where there's certain stages that may take place within a whole group of people. So perhaps since we're looking at a whole mass of society descending into a certain mindset, it may relate to this idea of a mass ideology being pushed onto a certain population. Psychosis usually refers to not knowing the difference between what is real and what is not. Well, as we move into the age of AI and technology, this might become more apparent, I would say. So there's also similar to this, the idea of the waves of terror and menticide. So we mentioned statism, mass psychosis. You're going to be noticing there's different terms to describe some of the phenomenons that happen here. Here are insights from Dr. Just Merleau, and he says, quote, "It is simply a question of reorganizing and manipulating collective feelings in a proper way." This is what menticide is considered. And so states, or you can say institutions of different kinds, perhaps, may use waves of terror, creating fear, then calm, and then repeating that effect. Each fear greater than the next. And so the morality lowers and the propaganda becomes higher. And you can look at a situation like COVID, which wasn't so long ago from when we're making this presentation, and people assume that the law must intervene, but at the expense of feeding into these waves. Right? People are falling for the fear, so they say, okay, well, what could we have to do? We have to make a mandate. We have to make this certain thing legal or illegal. We have to start using the law immediately to help solve our problems. And so there's this problem, reaction type of solution that we saw before. We charted that, and we have to be aware of that. Are we reacting or are we responsive? And here's a book from Just A. Merleau called The Rape of the Mind. So very, loud title here, The Psychology of Thought Control and Menticide. And so this is lies justifying lies. He says, quote, "Logic can be met with logic, while illogic cannot. It confuses those who think straight. The big lie and monotonously repeated nonsense have more of an emotional appeal than logic and reason. While the people are still searching for a reasonable counterargument for the first lie, the rulers can assault them with another." Right? So people are still trying to figure out themselves, still trying to figure out the reality that they're in, but then you start throwing other things. Oh gosh, now we're a bit confused. So there's a distraction that's happening from the roots, creating a deeper tyranny, essentially. Lies on top of lies, and then it's like, where are we at a certain point?
The control of information leads to the manipulation of emotion. So if information is controlled, then that will impact people's thoughts and beliefs about what's going on, which then creates an emotional climate and then influences behavior. So if there are institutions that are controlling the output of information and what the populace receives, then in effect, they're going to highly influence the behavior. So I always think about who's gaining, from these behaviors that are being promoted. Is there a financial gain, a control and power gain, an authority benefit, right?
Mm. Yeah, and I think something that sticks out to me here is emotional appeal, because we talked before about the left brain, the right brain, or that masculine and feminine, and they're both at play here, looking at the power dynamic. And so when we're seeing like the victim and the dominator complex in different aspects of our society, it's interesting that the emotion is usually played on, it's being mentioned here, not so much logic and reasoning. I mean, we even saw before Yuri Bezmenov, who talked about ideological subversion, said that no matter how many facts you present to somebody, it's not going to be enough to really change their mind.
And remember that the medical field is very much a business, and there's a lot of profit going on. And if you look at this idea of monotonously repeated information or nonsense, it is through the repetition of information that ideas get programmed into people's minds. And that is one of the main tools for media, and advertising.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Corey, I'd like to just add quick in regards to your comment on the masculine and feminine is what we see playing out collectively with these two dynamics is actually the extreme polarized variation in their more inauthentic, wounded, or quote unquote toxic form. So that's how this game continues, is that we have that dominating superior complex with that masculine energy, which you can call it misogynistic, tyrannical, who's feeding off of an intimate relationship with the wounded feminine, who's overly emotional and controlled by her emotions. So the goal is to proceed. We need to find out what the refined version is of both of these energies so they can be in more of a right relationship, not one where they're feeding negatively or capitalizing off of each other's broken parts.
Yes. Nurturing the mind rather than manipulating the mind and manipulating the populace. So here's a summary of that video done by After School on Dr. Juiced Mirlo. The rulers can use social media and its addictive nature to their benefit. Technology brings people into a delusion. They're saying technology was, more likely to create that delusion mentality. And they say, here's a quote from the book: no rest, no meditation, no reflection, no conversation. The senses are continually overloaded with stimuli. Man doesn't learn to question his world anymore. The screen offers him answers already made. So, we're wondering about how technology is affecting people, how it's affecting the mental health of this generation. Well, here we have a great amount of insight. Is it possible that people are simply not resting, not taking the time to access that more feminine yin side of themselves? And they're in that very, fast-paced world of addiction and delusion or dependence and distraction. And so isolation worsens the problem due to conditioning without outside influence by others, right? So the isolation means more exposure to the technology, more exposure to those distractions that keep them captivated. And now there's games that are being released with virtual headsets, right, where people don't know the difference really between reality and technology because it looks so real. They're trying to make these games more and more realistic. And some of them are straight up just simulators of reality at a certain point, or doing things in reality that you wouldn't do in reality, but you can do in a video game. So the people start to beg for a more ordered world after they descend into this deception. And the rulers implement order, quote unquote, at the expense of freedom for further delusion. So society turns on itself to keep the rulers in place. Blind obedience destroys the spontaneity and creativity that produces life's joys, because people are just kind of like a blank slate, right? They're kind of just dependent on these technologies to feed them that creativity and what they want, but they're not really creating for themselves. So the counterattack to Menticide, the counterattack to this is must be in multiple ways. So truth should be shared. People can show by example. They can use humor, create a parallel society, and use constant action. These were the tips that were provided in the video.
I'll add here a generalization that emotional processing really requires slowing down enough to reflect, to have rest, to have verbal conversation. And that is true for all of our emotional processing. And in our fast-paced lifestyles and the push, push, rush, rush of our lives, there's very little time for that. And often people don't make the time, which then makes us vulnerable to being influenced subconsciously without our realization of what's being programmed in us and where we're reacting from. So I want to encourage people to really look at your own lives at the level of rest, the level of reflection. How much are you processing and talking about the things you're experiencing in a day-to-day basis, and really working on that balanced brain approach to life.
Yeah. What comes to mind here, talking about doctors in the medical field, is, showing by example. Are you healthy to show your client like what health looks like? Right? And so the same thing goes for anybody else who's offering a service. Are they truly representing the service that they are giving somebody else?
Corey, just to quickly add, the critical nature, parlaying off of both of what you're stating, is the relationship that we're having in our immediate environments. I believe that this also is another aspect. If we are unconscious in our environments, or we're in unhealthy relationship, or we're in work environments that are very unconscious and negative, there seems to have been this removal of the veil, so to speak, to where it's getting more and more difficult to separate from the environment around you. So course correcting this does require everything that you both have said. In addition to, maybe you need to reevaluate your environments and really truly understand how much your environments that you spend time in impact your ability to fight against this entropy that's really coming down on us in every direction.
Well, let's talk more about technology and what is truly possible for this day and age. There's something called bio-nano things, and the Internet of bio-nano things, just as similar to the Internet of Things in general. There's actually a term for this, abbreviation IOBNT. This is an emerging field in nanotechnology, biology, and communication. If you would like to expand on this for us, Stephanie, that would be great.
Sure. So bio-nano things have been around for a little while, but it is still considered quite emerging. And there's a lot of potential things that are going to be cultivated through this nanotechnology. And some may be positive, but there's also a lot of potential negative that can come from this. So getting educated is very critical. So it's called the Internet of Bio-Nano Things, and it refers to a network of biological and nanoscale devices that can collect, process, and transmit data within biological environments. IOBNT relies on biomolecular communication inspired by natural biological processes. This communication method encodes information into molecules, which are then transmitted through biological mediums like the bloodstream. So think about, we are using biotech now when we're, placing our hands on things and getting our photographs, and you're seeing this start to pop up in airports. And even, I think it was in Canada, I saw there was a Whole Foods that's literally using biotech and scanning you to be able to go into the Whole Foods. Okay. Wow. So again, when we're unaware, it might seem interesting or cool, or, oh, look, I got to get my picture taken before I go into the Whole Foods. That's quite a naive way to really look at where we're going environmentally. So just being aware of what's happening. We see it on our phones, within our banking systems, it's starting to pop up. So what they're trying to do is they're actually connecting our biochemistry with other facets of technology. So it can be dangerous. So to connect the biochemical domain of IOBNT with conventional electronic networks, as I said, bio-cyber interfaces are crucial. These interfaces enable the translation of biological signals into electric ones and vice versa. So this is really giving people access to our most intimate biology, and people who you never could think of in a million years would have this access, like your bank or the Whole Foods or somebody at the airport, are now, in lieu of claiming security or safety or for your safety, finding more clever ways to collect very personal and biological information. And there's some more risky things about this, as so far as potentially biotech or nanotechnology being put in things like vaccines or other chemicals and actually being put into our biology. So it's something to be aware of and research as you proceed forward.
Wow. Yeah, there's a lot of potential dangers I can see with this. You can even ask a search engine nowadays, use AI, and you ask it, hey, bio-nano things, what could it be used for? And I was just shocked to see what it came up with, right? In application, intra-body sensing and actuation, networks of nanosensors within the human body, can create continuous health monitoring and targeted drug delivery. There's environmental monitoring, which is engineered bacterial networks for detecting chemical agents or pollutants in various environments. There's smart drug delivery, which is theranostic systems that can be remotely monitored and controlled for precise medication administration. Now, again, it's looking at some of the benefits, like, oh, we're putting a drug into someone's body. Oh, precise medication administration. Well, that's better than having some doctor give you, a certain dose that he thinks is best because now it's working within your body. I think we have to be careful of this, right? And there could be an emotional appeal to this. It's like, oh, you have all these different problems. Well, if you put this in your body, it'll understand you better than I will. It will totally understand your condition and it'll help you out. It'll help us monitor future things. There's like an emotional appeal to get people onto this, not just a logical appeal.
Yeah, Corey, the other thing too, again, we have to be careful of this guise of goodness, which again, we have to be mature enough to understand what is good and how it can be abused or what we're not seeing. In terms of, let's just say for a type 1 diabetic, for someone to get precise insulin at a particular time, we understand that there can be good in terms of these things. But when it comes down to it, beneath that layer is basically a provider saying, I don't really trust my patient to take the medicine on time. So there's things below these things that I think it's very critical to not lose sight of. Why are we coming to this level of control? It sounds convenient. It sounds good. It maybe offers the provider assurance that they can trust their doctor because now they're in control. Yeah. Right. So there's some nuance and some psychological factors in there that I don't think we should leave out.
You're right. Is it a necessity? Because as we move forward and there may be a whole host of different diseases, we say that AI and technology knows it all. We might start just passing the responsibility over to the technology, not just to an external person from us.
I was just thinking about the potential dangers or things that could go wrong by trusting a non-human entity, something that is operating on its own and through a programming of some sort. We don't really know what it's doing, how it's interacting with our bodies. So it's a little scary to me.
I think the goal too is there's far and fewer between individuals who need constant regulation of medications. And I mean, that we can't be responsible enough to do it on our own. It is far and few between people who need this level of control in their health. The goal is always to create more of a responsible human being. And to empower them, not to continuously make more things, to make it more convenient to not be responsible for your health and wellness. That's going in the wrong direction.
100%.
Yeah, and relating that to the statism and freedom, it's like, are you truly free if you're still dependent on that external locus of control, right? It's like, oh, well, it's inside me, it's internal. It's like, no. It's still something outside of you that you were not born with that was put into you, right? But I think at a certain point, maybe if you have that since a very young age, you may not even know the difference that it was something added into you. I mean, this is the world we're moving into. People entering a psychosis of, again, not knowing what is real and what is not, quite naturally, to where they don't see it as a psychosis.
Yeah, Corey, I just want to really quickly add, I have some family members, little side note here. I have some family members who constantly ask me to be part of an app called Lifetime. I think it's called Lifetime. And it's where they can track where anybody is at any time through their phone. So you can see where your family members are, or where they're driving, or where they're at. And I obviously try not to do that, but I think about this desire for more control of other people's space and time. Same with medicine. This is very dangerous. My family, they claimed that they used it at first for their children, to keep track of their children. So back in the day, we would let kids freely play outside, and we didn't have to track their every breath and every step and every move. I'm not saying there's not danger out there, but I think that we are a bit control obsessed. We've become control freaks at monitoring what everybody's doing at all times, because in essence, we don't trust. We don't trust others. We don't trust ourselves. And now it's just more control, more control, more control, and more control. And now you can see the same thing happening in the medical system in that proxy parent relationship of, well, let me just make a sweeping claim that I can't trust my patients that much, or certain I can't. So if I can just be a helicopter doctor and just know their every move and have their medicine go in through AI every hour on there, then it feels safer. And again, I think we just have to be cautious that this is not the way towards individuation, freedom, and sovereignty. This is the way towards having a society that's deeply in fear and doesn't know what to trust or who to be, or we're going in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Good point. And we mentioned before, George Orwell and Aldous Huxley and people who have theorized the future and people's mindsets. So, if you're taking in a lot of this information and connecting it, you just see insane parallels. And so there's this idea of a technocracy, right? Which is basically a government ran by technology or ran by the statistics, ran by the experts because they have it all figured out. And AI knows way better than us, right? And it can sustain generations. So at what point do we say that technology should just be the governor, or should be the physician, or should take on those roles of authority? And so here are some of the things that the bionano things can do that could potentially be used to create more sophisticated biological weapons. Targeted delivery, stealth capabilities, covert surveillance, mind control, which includes cognitive and behavioral modification, and biological hacking, which includes data theft, hijacking bodily functions. Just by reading that in the first place, how familiar are you with these concepts, right? Because this is something that is rolling out rather quickly. AI is developing very quickly nowadays. Technology is making insane improvements. And if we're not paying attention to it, we have to be quite careful within our own practice, within our own lives. And so weaponized living electrodes in military applications could potentially be used in concerning ways. So neurocontrol, living electrodes could potentially be used to directly interface with and manipulate a person's nervous system, potentially allowing for forced behavior modification or control of motor functions. So again, this is a potential military application. Covert surveillance. Microscopic living electrode systems could theoretically be used to secretly monitor neural activity and extract information directly from a person's brain without their knowledge or consent. Now, we mentioned before tons of examples of unethical experiments and unethical medical practices that were mostly due to this lack of consent, lack of knowledge. Well, like Leslie said, if it's happening to you so spontaneously, you don't really see it, you don't understand it, that's a big issue. And even if we say we understand it, do we really? I mean, there's many times people are signing into contracts and buying food, buying like food with different ingredients in the store, and it doesn't actually say what it has. And we have to be careful of that. Like, even if we regulate a certain product to say certain ingredients are bad for us, the industry usually finds a way around it. So at some point in time, we might have to say we have to take authority of our own lives. We need to pay attention to the food we're consuming, the information we're consuming, because we can't be forever dependent on the external factors. As much as, we want to say that we can't control everything and we can't be responsible for everything in our lives. We can, however, just have a general consciousness of what we're doing and be aware that the more we push to that external influence, the more we're heading into a form of potential danger. Living electrodes might be exploited to induce pain or manipulate sensory experiences as a form of torture or coercion. Soldiers could potentially have their cognitive or physical abilities artificially augmented beyond normal human limits. And living electrodes integrated into biological systems could potentially be used to hijack or disrupt normal physiological processes. So, like Stephanie said, directly into that system, directly changing different behaviors and cells and functions within the body. So let's talk more about the psychology aspect of this now that we got the technology part of the way, because we see there's a connection here with freedom and people's mindsets and how they let these things happen and how those technologies can be used for danger, because it's really up to us and what we choose to do with the tools we have in this environment. So, Social Psychopathology by Stefan Moffick, MD, he says, my hope is that developing a classification of social psychopathologies, whether including some variation of mass formation psychosis or not, could lead to helpful prevention and treatments. Certainly, such conditions do harm to others, let alone to the perpetrators themselves. So he's saying that we need to create a new classification for this mass psychosis, and that's not really receiving enough attention. Now, I don't know about what you guys think about this, but of course, it is important that we talked about mass psychosis, but is it worth making a classification? We talked about the problems before of labeling diseases and putting certain labels and classifications on people. Is that really something we want to do? Because isn't that within itself a delusion? The fact that people are much more than what we label them, much more than what we classify them to be. But nonetheless, I see the intent here and wanting to see the prevention and treatments for something that is on a mass scale, on a society scale.
It's tricky because most people would not even see that they are part of this concept of a mass formation psychosis. People are, by definition, not admitting that they are in any state of delusion. And I think that the categorization isn't particularly helpful if we're not helping people to gain personal self-mastery and self-awareness and that process of self-reflection and grounding oneself in their physical reality and understanding their personal psychology and being able to manage the fear responses that are that they're having to the environment. I think that the answer is more on an individual level than it is in necessarily creating more labels.
And really, I encourage you out there listening to this, tell us, are we wrong? Is the truth not with the individual and with trying to achieve individual sovereignty and freedom? I think that we're hitting that as a point very commonly within these points that we're making here. So that need for freedom.
And truth finding. I think people, if they, taking a stand to seek the truth and to question the storylines and the directions and directives of their governing bodies, right? To really start to demand access to a broader range of information and ask questions. Seems to me this is where the power really lies, to break this trance of this mass formation.
Yeah.
The tricky component here is that we tend to not move when we're comfortable. And I sadly believe that there's a lot of people comfortable in their delusion. And, even to seek out the truth tends to come at the behest of somebody not feeling great and starting to question their reality. Usually there is a psychological, physical motive that wakes you up, so to speak, to the deeper nature of what may be going on within the world. But, it's good to at least ask yourself, am I living a codependent life? Like what would happen if I didn't have the comforts and security that I have right now? Could I survive? How would I do with less? Start to question, am I in a codependent relationships? Are all of my relationships codependent? Or are my relationships interdependent and somewhat healthy? One thing that's very uncanny, and I know we're moving into psychology here, is that over the last 1 to 2 to maybe 3 years, we've seen this immense proclivity online towards people talking about narcissism. It's just, I felt like everybody was talking about it. And all of a sudden, everybody was labeling and diagnosing people with narcissism or a narcissistic behavior, or are you with a narcissist? How to get away from the narcissist. This is a call to help people understand that a lot of us are involved in unhealthy dynamics, not just in partnership, but in certain family dynamic, friend dynamics, and especially the dynamics we're in with our systems. It's a reflection. So if that's you, if you feel you've been victim to a narcissist in your life, it's probably a good indication that you are in codependent relationships and don't see your part amongst it. I see a lot of people who, again, it's easier to blame someone else for their discomfort than to understand their part of the dynamic. I mean, very classic Sam Vaknin, amazing psychologist, often will say, you see narcissists with the super empath, these identities that we give each other, these two ends of the unhealthy spectrum. And basically he's saying that you're both willfully participating in this, but it's easier to blame one and feel like you're the victim within it. So if you feel you're a victim in anywhere in your life, it's time for you, as Leslie said, to start seeking the truth and start to understand your part in all of your relationships, and are they codependent, and then to start do that inner introspection, emotional processing to start to evolve yourself.
Right.
I mean, I'd like to see this as elementary work in our day-to-day lives, you know, that this concept of how do you maintain a healthy emotional mental state, that should be taught to everyone, to young children, right? That should, if we have a school system, that really needs to be part of that education, and the medical system not separating the physical health from the mental health, but really integrating them as they truly are in our beings, in our humanness,
Right.
so that, you know, we are really every person becoming aware of their own psychology and how it works.
We have so much potential as human beings. We have so much potential. Energetically, psychologically, emotionally, physically, spiritually. We are so far beyond these compartments as so far as healing and building a self-aware, constructive world where we love each other. This is an option for us. And sadly, it's not just unawareness that's stopping us, although that's a big part of it. It's that people are willfully loving their own hell that they're in, and they love the drama connected to the trauma and the story, and it's just it blinds the perception from the fact that there's a much better, healthier story that's far beyond this story that we're in right now. So as you guys said, I pray that we can wake up, that, you know, let's start to unaddict ourselves from not just all the tech, but from the drama, from the people that we're with, the stories, the news, the TV, the social media, what any celebrity is doing. Personally, I cannot believe that there are people still giving two hoots about what any celebrity says. Like, I'm shocked that people are still following celebrities the way that we're following celebrities. What a waste of your valuable essence and energy.
Yeah. Hey, Scott, I'd be curious what you think about this idea of classification. You know, this individual is telling us that we should classify, you know, this idea of a mass psychosis for people. But what could we do instead?
Well, to make such a diagnosis is only marginally beneficial. It's sort of like telling the person that they're in a mass psychosis and they didn't know that before. However, the idea of personal responsibility still has not hit the person just by giving them that diagnosis. Now they know that there's such a thing as mass psychosis, that they may be a part of it, but immediately it's like, oh, everybody else is in this psychosis, and I'm not the only one. And so I think the next step, the real step forward, you can give the diagnosis or not. It doesn't make a whole lot of difference. But the real step forward is to teach the individual that they can do something different from the herd, from the group. That's a little difficult for a lot of people. Everybody's at a different stage as to what kind of courage and personal responsibility they're willing and ready to take. But to get them oriented towards that next step is probably the most effective thing you can do. We're in a mass psychosis. We're only going to get out of this by everybody being themselves and not going along with the herd and not accepting the propaganda, and challenging people to do that and validating that. So as a group, you know, we're still a group of individuals. As other individuals, we can validate and encourage personal courage, personal standing for what's right, that kind of thing. So that's what I would propose.
I love Scott's comment on incentivizing becoming authentic, incentivizing doing the difficult thing and not staying comfortable, incentivizing those who are willing to break out of difficult situations. It seems that it's the very opposite that's playing out in society right now. But then, you know, it keeps all the life coaches busy, you know, because all they talk about is transformation and become your authentic self. So there's a call for it. There's a movement for it, but it is separate. It's segregated from our traditional systems of health and wellness. So it's like we've got these two forces butting up against each other. And it, you know, there's a reason why life coaching is, you know, one of the most sought after fields right now is because the way we've been doing things, keeping people trapped in the tribal mentality with the mask on, is actually contributing to more health and unhappiness. So the force is coming, it's upon us. It's just, what is it going to look like when these two truly collide? Is there going to be an openness, or are we still going to be lying and hiding and trying to keep the system in the facade that it's at? So,
Yes. And I observed that too, you know, going to a health coach institute myself. And I noticed a lot of, you know, women out there who were part of the health coaching field. And a lot of them had that very feminine energy, bringing that into a very, you know, Western scientific means. And a lot of them were bringing Eastern modalities like yoga, meditation to that, which I found very interesting. And a lot of people are getting help through those modalities. My question is, how much do they know about these ideas of freedom that we're talking about, right? Is freedom within the conversation? Is sovereignty and autonomy within the conversation? Because even among alternative health practitioners, I don't see a great understanding of that. And when we're talking about statism, what we're doing here is by saying like there's a mentality that people don't know about that they have, is we're saying there already is a mass psychosis happening right now that people don't see.
Corey, I just want to add something, a subtle little tangent here that may be relatable to the general public watching this. I watched the Martha Stewart documentary last night on Netflix. I don't know that much about Martha Stewart other than the obvious. But basically, what really struck me was that when she got the idea to create her Martha Stewart Living magazine and to optimize the domestication of women and to have women move back to beautifying their home and cooking from home. She said that she was disenfranchised by the feminist movement of women going out to work, and nobody was really, you know, honoring the domestication of women anymore. So she had this idea to come up with this magazine, Martha Stewart Living. And basically she said that she already had a level of success with her catering business. She was catering large, popular, famous events. But she went to take her concept to some of the hottest magazine publishing agents around. She went to New York, she went to Forbes, she went to Time, and she said she would sit amongst all of these very high-powered men. And she would say, this is what I want to do. And they would say, I don't get it. I don't get what is selling here. Where's the money coming from? What are you selling? And she said, I'm selling living, something we do every day, something that we're all a part of every day. And she said that no man there had any idea that living actually could sell. They couldn't connect. They couldn't connect the dot of the domestication and women and their role in society. And I just thought it was very interesting, related to what we were saying, is that she just said that everybody kept denying her because they didn't get it. She said, no man got it. And then she said, at some point, somebody gave her a try, and then she became like the world's first female entrepreneurial billionaire. And she said, it didn't matter if they didn't get it, the high-powered men. She said, the world got it, and they needed it. So I thought that was just such a powerful story based off of exactly what we're trying to say is that I think in the medical field, there are a lot of people, they just aren't seeing what they don't see. They just don't get it. And it's going to come in like a force. And at some point, they're going to see what we're saying, this holistic intelligence, this emotional awareness, that where health and healing comes from. It starts from within. But I think we're still at this place that literally people are blind to that which a lot of what we're trying to say, because they just don't see how they can make money or capitalize or create an incentive around keeping them in business based off of these things that we're saying.
Yeah. Wow. Great story, Stephanie. Thank you for sharing that. So there's a perceived difference. Here's a book, A Problem in Psychology, Out of Step by Frank Chodorov. Quote, I am inclined to believe that the thought processes of the bureaucrat and the elected official are so distinct in kind as to constitute major classification. The first thing that strikes you when you come into contact with the appointed official is his peculiar admixture of obsequiousness and arrogance. Toward his superior, his benefactor, he shows a deference that is not different from that of a flunky, while toward the general public, his attitude is supercilious and condescending. He is government, while they are the public. Perhaps a subconscious recognition of his utter uselessness, his parasitical position in life, causes the bureaucrat to so swell himself up. So there's a lot going on here, what he's talking about in this paragraph, between the ego and that left brain dominator versus that victim who is the public, who perceives this government authority as more special than them, as this person who must rule over them. And, it is a classification within itself to call these certain people authority figures, to say these people are rulers over my own lives. So, when we're talking about classifications with disease, what about that classification of, putting these certain titles and identities on people? Because that's having the same effect in regards to limiting people's great potential, as Stephanie said. People have amazing potential, and yet we limit them with these different titles. And that can be very dangerous because we're putting some people above others or certain people below others. And aren't we all equal? Don't we say we all have equal rights and we're all part of the same human family? What happened to that? If we're going to treat somebody as a physician because we care about them, not just because we are a physician, then we're on the same level plane as them, right? And we're not trying to say, well, we have all the answers. They need to depend on us for their medicine and for their health. I mean, besides, we don't live in their body.
It reminds me of just the utter inefficiency of government and this, what I would call like dead wood. What is there an intrinsic value and benefit to people in a lot of these governmental processes, even looking at like audits and, the people who are, getting salaries for just like cataloging information or checking permits, or there's so many jobs that people are getting paid for that with our tax dollars that I think are worth questioning the value of. I feel like there's such an inefficiency and a lack of understanding of respect for the people. And that I wanted to share an example of this. When in working with a organization that was an org provider for the county. So in order to provide services to children and families, we had to follow the county regulations and their like 30-page requirements of documentation that took a lot of time away from the actual clinical work. So the therapists really were trying to do their best hands-on with people, but would have to, take their time away from that actual service to do hours and hours of paperwork that is very questionable whether it was helpful, to anyone, and not really helpful to the client or that therapeutic interaction, but required by the state. And then auditors would come in and they would micromanage the documentation and the words that a therapist would use. And there was one example of therapists using the word support as part of their intervention in the note. So they were providing, emotional support or therapeutic support. And one auditor had the audacity to say that that is not a professional service. It does not require a master's degree, and therefore they denied the service. They denied paying for that whole intervention, and because of being so picky about language, by an arbitrary, it's a total arbitrary decision by someone who isn't even a real clinician doing the work. So,
Wow. Yeah.
I want to add real quick, Leslie, to something a little more extreme that you were saying is in the field of organ transplantation is there's a team of doctors. I know that there was I forget exactly what it was, but there was a news broadcast on this or a written material saying who has the right here in this room to actually decide who's eligible for a kidney or an organ transplant and who's not eligible. Like they're taking these facts supposedly in front of them, or they're just looking at the person. And at some point, somebody has to determine whether that person decides whether they live or die based off of certain criteria. We're making these, like you said, who's really, do we have the right level of not just information, but heart, soul? I mean, it just seems like we're delegating rights and responsibilities towards certain people that shouldn't be there, and then too much to other people. And it's very tricky territory. But I see what you're saying, Leslie, is, computational skills, counting this, counting that. It just seems like it's all a big fraud at some point.
Well, it's very frustrating, having auditors come in that like know federal law, for example, but don't know the state law,
Right.
and then don't even understand what they're looking at, and they're there to judge it and to end up denying it. It's a very wasteful process, and it's not logical.
Yeah.
It's not having the individual consumer of that service, their interest at heart. It's lip service to that, but
Robotic.
it's really not about that.
It feels robotic to me. It feels like even though we don't have nanobots necessarily in people now, people are presuming that role of becoming the robot by simply following orders, doing what's on the clipboard and sticking to the numbers and the statistics. And then they take out their heart from it. They're not no longer caring for the person.
Right. It's already been in existence through humans doing that role, right? Given certain keywords that they have to look for, and certain boxes to check is really the main auditing. And then now it's going to be more and more replaced by these bots, where there's no, room for human discernment. It's like the whole process of critical thinking and human discernment is becoming less allowed. And people on the front lines who you're asking for help or trying to get solutions from, they're just kind of like following these arbitrary rules, and they don't have the authority to change them. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's a very disconnected system, more and more so, and losing the heart and the human interest really in the process.
One thing too, Leslie, like you said, is we've complexified the relationship between the different layers amongst systems. Everybody has a subtly different language. So it's kind of, we've actually purposefully, I think, confused ourselves too. I mean, you have these different layers. You have the upper management, the middle management, the lay person, the patient, the doctor. And it's like we're all speaking different languages. So there is a lot that gets lost in translation because we somehow felt the need to complexify and separate our English language into all of these different fanciful tiers of who can understand what and who has access or privilege to really know what's going on. So we've almost done this to ourselves, sadly.
Yeah. Yeah, and I find it interesting that, you have several people here saying that, there is a classification we can put upon these different individuals within society that exhibit certain traits, but I think it only reinforces what we're saying as to its importance to look at this idea of, here's the government, here's the people, here's the state and statism, and here's the people who are presuming that belief system and trying to be something that they're not. It's not authentic. And so, ask yourself, if you're being a robot, if you're order following, are you truly expressing yourself, your own humanity, your own conscience, as we would call it? So here's an example of statist health measures because, the health often interferes with the state. And as Leslie mentioned, you have a bunch of people who are not doctors, who are not clinicians, who are giving health advice through the form of law, right? So here's a quote. Participants of different ages and educational levels from all over Germany reported strong declines in autonomy and well-being. This was during COVID. Small declines in relatedness satisfaction, moderate increases in anxiety and depressive symptoms. People's need for autonomy was most strongly affected by the lockdown measures. Among general suicide, depression and anxiety rates increasing. Social media usage also went up, which has problems of its own. And it says, quote, 4 domains of social media, the time spent, activity, investment, and addiction, all domains correlated with depression, anxiety, and psychological distress. And so there's some studies. And again, you can go deep into the statistics part, but we wanted to just bring it back to the statistics just to remind you of this is what happens when perhaps you have, a mass psychosis, a mass hysteria, a mass response to something that people are very fearful about. Like, oh, there's this virus going on, we got to do something. So they lock down this entire country, and then all these people start all of a sudden having all this mental health problems. So is the solution worse than the disease? I mean, at what point are we just treating symptoms after symptoms after symptoms, never getting to the roots? So, mass hysteria without statism. Let's look at this as a quote from Mises Institute, and we have another study there. As a correlative mechanism, there exist well-known strategies to reduce fear and anxiety. In a free society, people are free to make use of these strategies. One can release tension from one's body through sports and exercises. Moreover, it is essential to find distractions from the negative news and socialize. In a free society, these distractions abound. It is true that hysteria can lead people to inflict enormous harm on themselves and others. Yet in a free society, there exists an essential limit to the havoc caused by mass hysteria, and this limit is private property rights. In a free society, mass hysteria cannot lead to a massive violation of private property rights by the state, simply because the state does not exist. Moreover, while anyone in a health hysteria may voluntarily close his business, wear a mask, or stay at home, in a free society, no one can force others who do not succumb to the hysteria to close their businesses, wear masks, or quarantine. So there is a difference in how we respond based on this idea of statism, if we have it present within our society or not. Will people have more options to do things like yoga and community gardening and more family businesses and different types of medical practices because people are more free to do so without statism? These are the questions that we have to ask, because there will come times in history where there are fears that go around and social media spreads words very quickly. So people start creating rumors and people say, oh my gosh, there's this virus, there's all this stuff happening. That may always happen, but how do we respond? That's the key. If we are in control of ourselves and we are in control of our responses, what do we have to worry about everything that comes at us, right? There's a self-mastery that helps us become more immune to that, just like an immune system. When it's exposed to different bacteria that's foreign to it, we're always exposed to different things. The dependence is on us and how we respond.
During the lockdown in many areas, the social planners kind of revealed their hand. There's probably no one that will argue that getting outside in the fresh air and into a park, getting some space is a very healthy thing. According to the arbitrary 6-foot limit, that's not in violation. And yet, you could see in certain countries, in certain areas around the world, people being harassed for getting out in the fresh air and sunlight for their health in a time where that was needed more than anything. So this is a huge reveal on the agenda of statism. and the abuses of statism and the complete contradiction in common sense health and public health. So that this is a very important point and very important slide, because the rights of an individual were violated, and when you do that, you reduce the health of the society, because people are not allowed to implement common sense health solutions on their own that would keep their health and their morale, which relates to their health, in a high zone personally. You know, it was kind of a tragedy that the recent COVID lockdown forced us into very self-centered personal approach to health. But it's a double tragedy that those who tried to actually implement that and take advantage of that were discouraged or prevented from doing that.
Yeah.
You know, guys, I lived in New York City during the tail end of COVID not that long ago. And my apartment complex was a historic landmark that used to be a tuberculosis sanitarium. And how ironic, I think it was, you know, probably back in the, 50s, 60s, how ironic that the building was built so that there would be optimal sunlight and spaces for tuberculosis patients to bask out in the sun.
Wow.
And I just thought, how strange that here I am in New York City, where I'm in this gorgeous landmark building that was literally set up and designed and created and architected in a way to give patients extra sunlight and connections to the outdoors. Very opposite, complete opposite agenda of what we were being taught when COVID hit. So strange.
Yeah. And I look at medical facilities and the hospitals, I'm like, it's not the best environment. It could definitely be better. You know, where are the plants? Where is the creativity just within the hospital environment itself? And I think it's very also quite interesting to see, Scott mentioning that essentially the rights of the individual correlates to the health of the individual. Well, we talked about before, Mark Passio, an individual who's a researcher, he defines rights as that which does not cause harm. Well, what's the goal of medicine? What's the goal of the medical field? Not to do harm to ourselves, to our body, to others. So I see an alignment here in the goals of trying to create freedom for the individual, freedom from disease, freedom from all forms of restraint on the individual simply wanting to live their life happily, peacefully, healthfully.
You know, Corey, providers that do work in hospitals, which it's a formidable bunch of individuals, is you have to realize that they themselves are in a very sterile, artificially lit environment that tends to be very cold. It's almost as if something within them has been suppressed from being in that artificial, very closed off from nature environment for so very long.
Wow. Yeah, you mentioned before the importance of environment. That is huge. What's the feng shui in a hospital? I don't know how good that is, right? But do we have much knowledge of that? That's an Eastern practice, right? It's like, are we including plants within that environment? Like you said, the lights. I mean, we know how blue light affects people at night in their sleep. So we're being exposed to that as physicians. Like, what's going on? It's insane.
And doesn't the hospital environment with its over chlorination of everything, this cleanliness lead to antibiotic resistant
sepsis,
bacterias and things, right? They're that being that devoid of natural kind of bacteria actually backfires and is dangerous and creates illness and infections that are very stubborn, even more stubborn and resistant to our typical ways of healing. And the very best thing may be to get out in the sun and to get in the fresh air. And ironically, beaches were shut down. People were arrested, knocked down by police officers for walking their dogs on a beach. During the lockdowns, a lot of fear and violence really ensued that was very irrational. Talk about hysteria.
What's very interesting, you guys just brought up a point that I feel is interesting and important, is that there's a time and place in a surgical room to have a sterile environment and to have your tools sterilized. I understand that that's a critical time and place to be sterile, but there's an equally as critical time and place to be connected with nature and the dirt and the microbiome of the earth. That also helps to build our immune system. So it seems to me that we have to do a better job at literally understanding the polarity and the necessity and the time and space for a sterile environment and the time and space for a natural healing environment outside. It seems like somehow we're prioritizing one over the other, or not at least giving them equal playing rights.
Mm-hmm. And is that, a coincidence that, we're talking about the natural versus the artificial when we just talked about, robots going in people's bodies and people acting as robots? I mean, are these coincidences, or is this leading us to what our solution is? And I have a message on my channel, nature is the answer. I think that's quite self-evident. But, someone like David Rodriguez, who we mentioned before, talking about the schooling system, he went to the beaches in California and he documented this. So if you want proof of somebody who got kicked off of the beach, he just went to the beach with a bunch of people. And there were people who were confronting him saying, you should not go to the beach. And then here in Florida, where I am, people just went to the beach anyways. And they totally ignored, different mandates, and they had fun, and that was quite an interesting thing to see, because the media would attack them and say, look at all these people on the beaches, kind of shaming them in a way for choosing what to do that makes them happy during that time.
What's a bit alarming is to see the amount of people that willfully, without question, stayed indoors because somebody told them not to go outside. I mean, that's radical, willful ignorance. I mean, if that's where we're at societally, we have much more to contend with.
Yeah.
The fact to say, oh, well, I can't go outside. I mean, that really would demonstrate the amount of fear that really is being circulated throughout our environment. And again, we're not separate from our environment. So those of us who are doing our work and are, really trying to hold ourselves accountable, we're still affected environmentally by this collective fear.
Yeah.
We all need to take responsibility. So the fact that they said we couldn't go outside, that is insanity.
Last time I checked, parents are trying to get their kids more outside. They're trying to get people more outside because of all the technology, because of all the distractions. So it's quite funny to see how, there's that push in society. Well, wait, maybe you should stay inside. That very interesting for sure. Because I'm sure many people would agree with my sentiments to say, well, wait, maybe we should go outside more, not less.
And what was the consequence of that whole lockdown? I think it resulted in people very confused and anxious about what to do, whether they should wear a mask, whether they should be near people, whether they should go outside, whether they should stay in, whether they should Zoom, whether they should go to a public event. Should I go to the concert? There's so much confusion that resulted, and a real escalation in anxieties.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a small minority, quote, a small minority who continue to live their normal lives and are free to do so can be a wake-up call to those who succumb to the mass hysteria, especially the borderline cases. Imagine that a small group of people continues to go shopping, to work, to breathe freely, to meet with friends and family, and that they do not die. Others may then follow their example, and the group of hysterics shrinks. While the destruction inflicted by mass hysteria is limited by private property rights in a free society, such limits do not exist when there is a state. Indeed, a well-organized group that has succumbed to mass hysteria may get control of the state apparatus and impose measures on the rest of the population and inflict untold harm. The possibility of mass hysteria is an important reason why the institution of the state is so dangerous. So again, bringing medicine into politics, right? I have a solution. I know what should be done with everybody's lives and their health. So I'm going to run for office. I'm going to impose my will on them using law. I'm going to claim to be an authority figure, so they must obey me. They must do everything I say. And everybody looks up to them and puts on all these fancy robes and rituals to support that position. And meanwhile, there's a small minority who says, that doesn't make any sense. I'm going to live my life. I'm going to do my thing. And I'm not harming anybody. I'm going to do what makes me happy. They're not affected by the world outside of them because they're focused on that autonomy of themselves. Is that selfish for somebody to do? Or is it somebody who knows thyself? And so they're willing to stand on it.
And I think in addition to the idea of happiness, it is about a person who claims their right to do what creates their own health, as long as it doesn't hurt other people. And it was this idea of harming, the fear of harming others, that kept people so confused about what to do. And, in hindsight, we can see that a lot of that propaganda was false.
Yeah, you're going to kill your grandma, right?
Yeah, it's very important that people look at that objectively in order to be able to see the level of like propaganda and control that was taken over people's lives, and that was for no real benefit or gain to the public itself. But
yeah,
somebody benefited.
You were heavily criticized if you actually chose free will and went outside of the tribe. You were canceled. They were starting the cancel culture even, I think, before COVID hit. It was, you are going to be punished if you don't go along with the tribe, and your reputation will be tarnished. Your entire identity will collapse if you don't follow instructions.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, we have a whole list of people.
Yeah. Let alone just individual people who treated other people, horribly.
Yeah. How many families broke up? I mean, it's still happening. It's still happening now with this current election period. It's going to cause almost the inverse argument and separation and divide again.
Yeah.
So it's just that they almost have us spinning on a loop.
Yeah.
Fighting amongst ourselves.
Exactly. And I'm very curious. I'm very curious to hear if you guys are seeing any more about people who are waking up to those order followers who were telling people to not go on the beach, or I have to, attack you because you're outside walking your dog when you're supposed to be on lockdown. Are any of these people speaking out? Are any of these people waking up? Are any of these people apologizing? In fact, what I've seen most recently on social media, just in the last couple of days since the 2024 election, is that now that we know which direction the country is going to be perceivably going in with who got elected into office, I'm seeing people that were on the other side now just very nonchalantly flipping into the narrative that's now in control. Very interesting. I'm seeing a lot of people say, oh, well, now we need to talk about our health and wellness now that they know that RFK might get into the health agency. It's like I'm seeing all these people who weren't courageous enough to speak out against what was right before they knew who was going to be in control. But now they know who's in control. They feel safe and comfortable to now say, yeah, I want to talk about that too. Now I want to be a part of that, just to almost stay relevant.
And that comes with its own dangers too, because, the authority figure that gives everything that the people want is more likely to be followed as an authority figure. And there were many tyrannical leaders throughout history, which is why people worship them as like deities, we showed before, because they did everything. That was just like rebooting the economy and rebooting all the systems, but it still was not really focused on the individual and their freedom, right? Again, we can have all the technology in the world to help people, all the medications. It's not going to fix the underlying root cause problem.
Right. Yeah, we can't have leaders who just are hiding under the guise of giving society what they want or what they need and switching at the turn of a hat to just stay in that position of authority. We were really called, I believe, to really stand up for what was right over the last couple of years and to make a stand and to use our voice in the face of being canceled, in the face of our reputation being broken. And there were a lot of people who did that and a lot of people who paid the consequence. But I truly believe in the end that things will come around and we will see the truth with those who stood up against the fear without knowing, willing to risk their reputation in line and in lieu of what was right, and those who are just playing a game to feel safe. I think it will make itself more and more known.
And thank you. Thank you for those of you who are courageous and stepping up to the plate, using your conscience. Thank you very much. So here are another way to basically break down mass hysteria. The first two acts, that first the state can, and as in the case of COVID, prohibit, diminish those activities that reduce fear and anxiety, such as sports and diversion. And the state actually fosters social isolation, contributing to anxiety and psychological strain, ingredients that spur mass hysteria. So that's the first step. The second step, the state takes a centralized approach to dealing with the source of the hysteria, and that's where we talked about problem, react, solution. They impose a solution, and in consequence, there is no or very reduced experimentation to solve the problem. People who have not succumbed to the hysteria and oppose the state's approach are suppressed. We talked about that. They cannot demonstrate alternative ways to confront the crisis because these alternative ways are prohibited by the state. As a consequence, groupthink increases, and the hysteria feeds itself as no alternatives are shown to people. Then the third step here, in this state, the media is often politicized. News outlets and social media platforms have close relationships with the state, and you can add medicine to this. Media outlets may be directly owned by the state, as are public TV channels. They may need state licenses to operate. They may look for the goodwill of state agencies, or may simply be staffed with people who were educated in state schools. These news agencies and social media platforms engage in mass negative news campaigns, intentionally scare people and suppress alternative information. I have a whole video sharing all the repeat lines across all the different channels of all the same things being said across all these different years. And the same thing with elections. The politicians say the same thing almost every single election season, saying this is the most important election of all time. We need to vote. It's very interesting to see this type of robotic in human beings. And of course, talking about the media, Scott mentioned before that a lot of their advertisements are medical companies. So it seems like it's kind of all interlinked. If people listen to, watch, or read negative and one-sided stories all day, their psychological stress and anxiety increases. Mass hysteria sponsored by a biased media sector may run out of control. Right? This is why there's such a thing as independent media or alternative medicine. Fourth, negative news from an authoritative source is especially harmful for psychological health and produces anxiety. So we see that within the independent media because they're getting attacked. They say, oh my gosh, you got to support us. We're getting attacked. Things are going to collapse. And they make it sound like there's a zombie apocalypse every day. I know firsthand because I know a lot of people who are, speaking up about what's going on, and they fall into another pattern of fear. It says, if there exists in society an institution of total power, such as the state, that intervenes in the lives of people from birth to death, the announcements of its representatives acquire weight. Many people attach great authority to these representatives and to the warnings of state institutions. So when a doctor such as Anthony Fauci speaks in the name of the state and tells the people to worry and wear masks, it becomes easier for mass hysteria to develop than would be the case in a decentralized society, because people view him as better, more important than the physicians and other doctors. He is in a position of power, right? He runs a certain agency that consists of tons of different doctors. So that perception plays a role into this.
That appeal to authority, which is a
Yes.
logical fallacy, takes over, and people defer to the expert, but then realize that these experts often are not speaking freely or independently, but they're doing what they're told because that's their job.
Mhm.
They're doing their job, and they're essentially being told what to say, what's acceptable, what's not, given the context of the role they're in. And I think people don't really think about that someone like Fauci, for example, and then the messages that are being echoed throughout the world, by politicians, are not coming truly from their own thinking and discernment, but because of, an influence, an agenda, a job that they're being given to influence the masses. And people fall for it because they've been trained to trust authority.
Yeah. Well, here's the final act of mass hysteria, and then you guys can share more about this. The state instills fear in the population, actively contributing to the making of mass hysteria. In fact, during the first months of the corona epidemic, an internal paper of the German Department of the Interior was leaked to the public. In the paper, the experts recommended that the German government instill fear in the German population. And the paper actually recommended increasing fear with 3 communication measures. So, we mentioned before from Mercola that there's certain leaks that will happen that shows these sort of underlying agendas and things that are taking place. And you ask yourself, like, what's going on here? Do they really care about our health? And does it really matter? We don't have to say we don't have to ask if they're caring about our health. Do we care about our own health? Are we in charge of our own health? So first, what the paper mentions is the authority should emphasize the breathing problems of COVID patients because the human beings have a primordial fear of death by suffocation, which can easily trigger panic. Second, fear should also be instilled in children because children get infected easily when meeting with other children. They should be told that when they in turn infect their parents and grandparents, these could suffer a distressful death at home. And so this measure intends to invoke feelings of guilt. You notice there's a psychological underpinning for each of these dynamics. So we have panic, and then we have guilt, and we have this primordial fear. And then third, the authorities should mention the possibility of unknown, long-term, irreversible damage after an infection, and the possibility of the sudden deaths of people who were infected. All these measures were intended to increase fear in the population. Fear at the end is the foundation of every government's power.
And just to clarify that this was the propaganda that was shared, not the truth. Right. And it wasn't the case that children got infected easily and spread it around, but these were the messages that were given to the frontline people, whether they were politicians or health providers. They were told to say these things to instill fear.
Yeah, well, even if it was true, right? I mean, it's still triggering panic, creating feelings of guilt. These are still causing those problems, right? So, I mean, I don't think, it's a good thing, generally speaking, just to have that lack of self-mastery that we're talking about, that lack of self-freedom.
They were preparing us for this, guys. Right before this happened, we had the BLM movement and the death of George Floyd. And what was the common phrase with George Floyd? What was the propaganda that was spread? Because the cop, right, allegedly put his foot on the throat, cutting off the breathing of George Floyd. And then this propaganda that went around, the statement was, I can't breathe. Wow. I can't breathe. This was right before this hit. I can't breathe. Right? So everybody was already, it's almost like if you really look deeply, we don't want to get any, I don't want to get conspiratorial here, but if you really look deeply, you see a very nuanced tapestry of fear that's almost preparing us for the next event, so it's we're at a critical time in nature where we have to understand that when we're kept in fear, guilt, and shame, it contributes to severe health issues, severe mental health, physical health issues. That's just a fact. And you have to find a way to overcome those fears within yourself to be able to try to interact with the cultural narrative of the day without becoming affected and be overwhelmed by this. We have to anticipate that this is something that happens and that you have to have the stamina within yourself to be able to face your own fear. I mean, Ernest Becker, I think I mentioned this before, wrote a book called The Denial of Death, basically saying that society's biggest issue is that we all suffer from a primordial low level of death anxiety. And if you can find a way to make peace with that, to make peace with the fact that, understand this life is fleeting, you're going to die at some point, and overcome your fear of death and be in the present moment as much as possible, you're not going to be as afraid when these agendas and propaganda starts to circulate, right? But if you're in a more naive mindset and you're living at the behest of what society says, the phone says, TikTok says, your TV says, you're going to be triggered at everywhere you turn. So we have to start maturing in our understanding of what our life entails, that we're all going to die at some point, and to be as cautious as you can without being your own tyrannical authoritarian figure, because you're just simply haven't overcome your own fear.
Wow. Good point. And, what comes to mind too is you're mentioning George Floyd as being potentially a predictive programming measure, right? Whether somebody looks at this as intentional or unintentional, it is nonetheless what happened as like, resulting in different, this thing happened and this thing happened, this thing happened. And the psychology that you're sharing is true. So regardless of, if people can disagree with it, so be it. But I also noticed as well, in correlation with what you mentioned, the vaping epidemic was happening right before this, where people were saying, oh my gosh, there's a bunch of people dying due to certain vapes on the market. That happened right beforehand. That was directly affecting people's lungs, and there was so much hysteria around that. And I delved deep into those companies that were promoting these different vapes, and they were all owned by, like cigarette companies. I mean, these vaping companies. And there was just a lot of shady things going on, ingredients that are still in some of these products. So the question is it all just, some virus, or is it something else too? And then it's like, of course, you had the flu and all these other things kind of coming into it too. So it can seem very overwhelming, I think, from that overlook from a medical point of view, looking at all these different things.
Corey, I just want to quickly add from an Eastern point of view, the lungs, which is something we're talking about here, the capacity to breathe, the lung health in Chinese medicine is related to grief. They say that lungs can get damaged due to unprocessed grief and a heavy amount of grief. And it's almost inverse here. Is like, what has this all caused? It really has caused a collective grieving process over what has happened over the last couple of years. How ironic that this is just somehow connected like that.
Wow. Yeah, so there you go. I mean, this is recent, right, as an event. And there's many things that happen, of things that leak and different information gets out there. And you often only hear about this within independent media circles because, as we mentioned, some of the information becomes, unfortunately, suppressed. So what is out there that we may not know about, right? Quite interesting. Here's a quote from H.L. Mencken, an author, who says, "The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary." Right, now, this is somebody way before COVID making this statement, saying that if there's an imaginary fear, imaginary thing that's going around, it keeps people in that state of alarmness.
Corey, I just want to add something back to real quick. My metaphysical statement about the lungs
Sure.
is in Chinese medicine and in Eastern philosophy, the lungs are very intimately connected with the heart. And it is through breathing deep that opens the gateway to the heart, to the higher heart center. So in my opinion, from my past studies, it just would make sense that when somebody's in an awakened heart center, they tend to be connecting their reason with their heart. They're thinking more holistically if you're coming from an opened, awakened heart center. And what happens when we're in an open, awakened heart center, when our logic and our emotions are on the same page and we're in the essence of wanting to love our neighbor, is that all of a sudden the systems of power aren't as useful anymore.
Wow. It's true. And so going back to Carl Jung and what he has to share with us, there is a problem with science and the state when they come together. We're talking about that merge that's happening. And equally so, that convergence that of people who are leaving the state, bringing their medicine with them. So you have people who are bringing their medicine to the state and people who are taking their medicine out of the state and saying, no, we want to be free to practice on our own and not be interfered with all these mandates and rules. And so he says scientific education is based in the main on statistical truths and abstract knowledge, and therefore imparts an unrealistic, rational picture of the world in which the individual as a merely marginal phenomenon plays no role. The individual, however, as an irrational datum, is the true and authentic carrier of reality, the concrete man as opposed to the unreal ideal or normal man to whom the scientific statements refer. What is more, most of the natural sciences try to represent the results of their investigations as though these had come into existence without man's intervention, in such a way that the collaboration of the psyche, an indispensable factor, remains invisible. An exception to this is modern physics, which recognizes that the observed is not independent of the observer. So in this respect too, science conveys a picture of the world from which a real human psyche appears to be excluded, the very antithesis of the humanities. Very deep, Young, going into this, and I think it's very predictive, very telling for the future world that, again, a lot of people rely on AI and technology as the solution. It is also why I wrote my book, Natural Intelligence, the Technology of Peace, with world leaders who are doing work with nature and trying to find technologies that work with our consciousness and recognizing that intuitive part of ourselves and saying that could not be lost. Because if we lose that, then AI is basically going to take over our natural intelligence, is what we argue in that book. And I think that term natural intelligence has not received the attention it may deserve just yet. But as time evolves and people recognize some of the things that Young is saying here and many others, I think it's going to become more apparent.
Reminds me of the concept of self-fulfilling prophecy and how we do create our own outcomes through our thoughts, feelings, and then actions based on our perception and our belief system. If we're not aware of it, we can create a self-fulfilling prophecy individually and as that collective who buys into that delusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a big emphasis here in Young with his works talking about the individual as opposed to the science and saying that, science is not really human as much as it should be, right? So that's like the main emphasis here, sort of to summarize, and that we can't so much rely on that to be the truth when there is an aspect of the irrational that we should respect, not necessarily always relying on statistics and the science. And so there's this scientific collectivism, bringing back the term collectivism we talked about before, and tribalism. He says, under the influence of scientific assumptions, not only the psyche, but the individual man, and indeed all individual events whatsoever, suffer a leveling down in a process of blurring that distorts the picture of reality into a conceptual average. We ought not to underestimate the psychological effect of the statistical world picture. It displaces the individual in favor of anonymous units that pile up into mass formations. Mass formations, mass hysteria, mass psychosis, these are related concepts. Science supplies us with, instead of the concrete individual, the names of organizations and, at the highest point, the abstract idea of the state as the principle of political reality. The moral responsibility of the individual is then inevitably replaced by the policy of the state, which even has a form of saying that, not in English. But he says, instead of moral and mental differentiation of the individual, you have public welfare and the raising of the living standard. So isn't that fascinating? Somebody who is not just looking at science, not just looking at the individual and their intuition, but looking at freedom and how that relates to their perception of the state, which is what exactly we are detailing here. People are putting the state above their own responsibility, above their own morals, above just simply individuals, and putting it in that position where it has control over everything. And so the state over individuals. And there's a lot of quotes here from Young that we have here. So I'm going to be skipping around maybe a little bit here for sake of time. But he says the goal and meaning of individual life, which is the only real life, no longer lie in individual development, but in the policy of the state. He He says the individual is increasingly deprived of the moral decision as to how he should live his own life. Instead he's ruled, fed, clothed, and educated. You're going to see some parallels to this with history that we'll mention as well. But like we can mention what we had before, talking about the Japanese internment camps, right? And we have all these camps. We're providing you with what you need. We'll keep you safe and secure if you come and follow us to these camps. But that has its own sacrifice, of your own freedom. And so he says the rulers in their turn are just as much social units as the ruled, and are distinguished only by the fact that they are specialized mouthpieces of the state doctrine. So he essentially is calling statism state doctrine within his works. Maybe at this time he did not know what statism was, that maybe that wasn't even a term developed yet, frankly, in our language. And it goes back since around the 1850s or so, that term statism, but only now is it starting to be recognized, and that's why we're doing this presentation as well, is to emphasize there's this idea of the state doctrine. So really putting it more specifically, I think we're adding on to what Carl Jung is observing here. These people are not authentic, these people who want to rule over us, just as much as the people who are dependent on them. Remember we talked about before the childlikeness status of the victim and that father or mother-like protector figure. And so, is it state doctrine or is it statism? Right? I mean, it seems to me like this is almost a direct parallel. He says the seemingly omnipotent state doctrine is for its part manipulated in the name of state policy by those occupying the highest positions in the government, where all the power is concentrated. And he goes into how there's this ego identification, this I am the state is me. And again, he has different ways of saying this, not in English. And he is thus the only individual, or at any rate one of the few individuals, who could make use of their individuality if only they knew how to differentiate themselves from the state doctrine. So they presume this role and it becomes their identity. They are more likely, however, to become the slaves of their own fictions. This is what he says. Such one-sidedness is always compensated psychologically by unconscious subversive tendencies. He says slavery and rebellion are inseparable correlates. Right? So if people are fighting that system, saying, oh my gosh, it's got to change, and we're fighting them, we got to get back our power, it's because they're being oppressed. And what do you see happen again and again? A cycle of history of these people are in power, no, these people are in power, no, these people are in power, these people are in power. People are fighting over the throne. He says, hence rivalry for power and exaggerated distrust pervade the entire organism from top to bottom. And, I interviewed Daniel Arnold, who was, in the police force and many different levels of the military for over 30 years. And he got out of it saying, man, I had this ego that I didn't realize I had. And he wrote several books on this, about violence and ego, and had this great awakening one day. And he said that within his ranks, within the military and the police force, he was just noticing everybody just didn't really trust each other. There was always just like this pervasive rivalry for who is on top, who to look up to. And you're also trained into that, not just by the language, but by the actions. And it's sort of just pervasive within that system as a whole. There is this idea of utopian collectivism, because when we're talking about the state and we're talking about potentially getting rid of these government or state systems, some people may say that's utopian. Well, here's what Carl Jung has to say about it. He says that, furthermore, in order to compensate for its chaotic formlessness, a mass always produces a leader who almost infallibly becomes the victim of his own inflated ego consciousness, as numerous examples in history show. This development becomes logically unavoidable the moment the individual masses together with others it becomes obsolete. Apart from agglomerates of huge masses of people in which the individual disappears anyways, one of the chief factors responsible for psychological mass-mindedness is scientific rationalization, which robs the individual of his foundations and his dignity. See, people view the state as very ideological. very scientific as we move again into the age of AI and the statistics. Oh, I did this in this amount of years, and according to my plan, if we do this, we will get this done and that done. It's very on the rational end of things. And then the emotional appeals comes in, to carry in with it. As a social unit, Carl Jung says, he has lost his individuality and become a mere abstract number in the Bureau of Statistics. There's that famous quote from Stalin from Russia who says, one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic, right? So that basically is in line with what Jung is saying here. He can only play the role of an interchangeable unit of infinitesimal importance. Looked at rationally and from outside, that is exactly what he is. And from this point of view, it seems positively absurd to go on talking about the value or meaning of the individual. So it seems utopian to talk about freedom, to talk about, individuals in charge of their own life, because, we're all just numbers. We're all just part of the scientific whole, this machine that needs to operate, that has always operated, always been this way. So it must be, we tell ourselves. And the statistics, have it so that way certain things need to be in certain places. And if you don't like it, well, it's just, it's fantasy. It's just utopian thinking. But isn't this utopian is the question, right? Because if we're saying that, human beings by themselves have consciences, are individuals, and that is what makes them, intuitive life being creatures, that turning them into a machine and turning them into a mold and indoctrinating them, isn't that quite utopian? Because we want to put them in a certain image, put them into a certain way, say, well, if we have them in this certain way, we can control them, we can get this out of them or that out of them. I think that's rather quite utopian. And so he said, indeed, one can hardly imagine how one ever came to endow individual human life with so much dignity when the truth to the contrary is as plain as the palm of your hand. So the truth is right in front of us, but yet it's so hard to come to grasp with because we're perhaps surrounded by this mass psychosis. So what you see is statistics over individuals, right? And again, I'm going to be summarizing a lot of this because this is a lot of Carl Jung, but this is really on point with what we've been talking about. Why should we let numbers get in the way of utopia? Carl Jung says, seen from this standpoint, the individual really is of diminishing importance, and anyone who wished to dispute this would soon find himself at a loss for arguments. Right? It's like, oh, well, if we put this person in office, this will happen, this will happen. We promise and give to people what they need, as if they're children. And so it's a utopian idea. And so why let numbers get in the way of that, right? And so we have to be careful of this type of utopia type of thinking. Which again, it's going to be thrown on both sides. You're a utopian for wanting freedom. Oh, you're a utopian for wanting to create a system that everybody must follow, and that if done a certain way will produce certain results. And so what he calls it, Carl Jung, is state slavery. Very direct with it. And he says the bigger the crowd, the more negligible the individual becomes. But if the individual, overwhelmed by the sense of his own pugnaciousness and impotence, should feel that his life has lost its meaning, which after all is not identical with public welfare and higher standards of living, then he is already on the road to state slavery, and without knowing or wanting it, has become its proselyte. The man who looks only outside and quails before the big battlelands has no resource with which to combat the evidence of his senses and his reason. But that is just what is happening today. We are all fascinated and overawed by statistical truths in large numbers and are daily apprised of the nullity and futility of the individual personality, since it is not represented and personified by any mass organization. So the individual is such a special, crucial, sacred thing that we need to uphold. And he says, since mass suggestion plays the predominant role here, it remains a moot point whether their message is their own, for which they are personally responsible, or whether they merely function as a megaphone for collective opinion. And he's referring to the different people in power, or even the people who follow them. Are they really themselves? Are they truly speaking for themselves, or are they under this unconscious slavery? Now, what is unconscious slavery? What does that mean? To be enslaved and not recognize that you are, or to want your own slavery. that's very dangerous. I wrote a whole book on slavery, and if you want the full picture on that, I definitely go into it, and I feature these quotes as well. Mental slavery being the root cause to all forms is what he's detailing here. And Jung, not just talking about all these other ideas, talks about the problems of limited government, actually. He says, in actual fact, society is nothing more than an abstract idea like the state. Both are hypostatized, that is, have become autonomous. The state in particular is turned into a quasi-animate personality from whom everything is expected, right? We say the state, the government. Like, what is it? It's just a bunch of buildings, a bunch of people, but is it anything actually, right? He says, the constitutional state drifts into the situation of a primitive form of society, namely the communism of a primitive tribe where everybody is subject to the autocratic rule of a chief or an oligarchy, saying that these different forms of government, even the ones that are constitutional and for the people, end up turning into autocracies or oligarchies. Okay. And these are just different forms of saying, authoritarian or totalitarian regimes of certain people in control of many, many people turning off their conscience, turning off their self-ownership and giving it away.
I wanted to briefly expand on the idea of mental slavery.
Sure.
I believe that that results from being subject to your emotions out of balance with reason. So if your emotions are dominating your decision making, then you are in a mental slavery. And especially if fear is that dominant driver, right? We need to have the balanced brain and the balance of reason and discernment on board and received, right? And not negated when one does speak, right?
I think also to add on, it's important to note that the inverse of what Leslie just said is also true, is that when we're obsessed with logic and reason without any subjective experience or feeling or emotion, we're disconnected from the whole as well. So that's, it's both sides. It's both sides of the brain or the personality or the individuals acting as proclivities in one side of the brain.
Yeah.
Need work. And that's the irony of the authoritarian complex, is that a lot of leaders that I've spoken to within, let's say, the medical system believe that it's, there's a disempowerment in line of their patients, right? They can't trust them. The patients are disempowered to self-care. They're maybe in their own mental slavery and their emotions are ruling, but they cannot see their own mental slavery of being locked in the objectivity without any feeling, without any connection to soul or spirit. So they can't see their own blindness to their own mental slavery. They're just blaming the patient.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very good stuff.
We'll expand on this idea of mental slavery here in a moment, but also Jung talks about religion and how that can actually be used as a deterrence away from government or as the greatest tool for government. So this is a particularly interesting one to me, considering the fact religion has often ties with the foundations of government, but also the foundations of medicine, right? There's priests and they have certain healing modalities to heal people. And even today, I'm sure the religions with just simply bringing people together and creating community can heal people. But also some of the religions that turn people against each other and divide each other may contribute to the opposite. Or maybe, some religion is too imposing on somebody and they feel like, oh, this is restrictive upon me, and now it's not healing for them. Religion can be seen in many different aspects, and there's, of course, different types of religion, different ways of practicing it, different interpretations. So here's what Jung has to say about it. And again, I'm going to be summarizing some of these points here by just reading some of the highlighted parts, but if you want, feel free to pause each slide and delve deeper into it. But he says, in order to turn the individual into a function of the state, his dependence on anything beside the state must be taken from him. So if you're seeing God or this other external authority as being more important than the state, well, now you're not going to give, the politician power, right? Now you're not going to create a system of government, or maybe even look up to your medical practitioner for medicine. You may just be looking up to God.
I think the last sentence on this slide is important to add.
Okay.
But religion means dependence on and submission to the irrational facts of experience. These do not refer directly to social and physical conditions. They concern far more the individual's psychic attitude. So religion itself can create a pseudo authority or pseudo truth that if one is told they must believe, then that is just as much of as being captive, right, as the state government itself.
Yeah. Just how powerful could it be? Well, let's see here what he has to say. He says the religions give or claim to give such a standpoint, thereby enabling the individual to exercise his judgment and his power of decision. Okay, so he's saying it's this external condition just like the state, but not the state. And so he says if statistical reality is the only reality, then it is the sole authority. There is then only one condition, and since no contrary condition exists, judgment and decision are not only superfluous, but impossible. Right? So accept the science and the science only, the statistics only. The government, our authority, and that's only. Don't look up to anything beyond us or external to us or different from us. Only trust us, right? And so he says, then the individual is bound to be a function of statistics and hence a function of the state or whatever the abstract principle of order may be called. Because there may be different terms for that abstract thing that you're putting your dependence on. And if it's not God, then what is it? Right? And so, part 3, he says the policy of the state is the supreme principle of thought and action. And the believer, on the other hand, the person who follows religion, while admitting that the state has a moral and factual claim, confesses to the belief that not only man, but the state that rules him is subject to the overlordship of God, and that in case of doubt, the supreme decision will be made by God and not by the state. So that means the state loses its importance. If, say, the state says, oh, well, we have to do this mandate and we have to impose it on everybody, but God tells you that that's wrong, who are you going to follow, right? And again, you want to replace the word God with your conscience or what you know to be right versus wrong. Same thing here. It's not the state.
I think it's a tricky conversation because in the structure of religion is an authoritarian model often, where there's a belief that the head of the church or the minister or priest has the direct information from God and is speaking that to the followers. So the religion can operate just like the state.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's what makes it dangerous to the state. But again, if the state uses religion and convinces them that maybe, the state has more power than God, then, it's a very interesting dynamic here that we're observing. But the way people perceive their reality is very important to the decisions and the actions that they make on a day-to-day basis. And again, this has a lot to do with health. I mean, people go to religion, they go to churches to get married, for funerals, for some of the most touchiest moments in life, the birth of a new baby. A lot of it is tied into religion. It's sort of part of our culture and our foundations of humanity. So it cannot just simply be ignored, but it should be learned from, observed, how it benefits people and how it can be perhaps very dangerous, right? So let's observe more here what he has to say. He says, the individual who is not anchored in God can offer no resistance on his own resources to the physical and moral blandishments of the world. So Young is here making a case that we kind of need something that's a little bit more powerful than just ourselves. He even kind of says that even our merely intellectual or even moral insight into our world is not enough, and that we need some sort of God or religious figure or some source external to us to have to look up to. And maybe this falls in line with what some, psychologists would believe is like an instinctual need to follow somebody other than us, right? Because of course we're emphasizing here autonomy in the individual following themselves and the truths that they can objectively learn in the world. But, is it more than that? Maybe there needs to be some assistance from learning like what Mark Passio teaches, natural law, which is something that is seen as like an external force that is divine and universal. Similarly, God, which, these two concepts can relate. And maybe you don't need to be in a religion to have morals, right?
The danger, I believe, lies in this sensationalist idea that we are our own gods. And wielding that power of, people in certain movements, even spiritual movements, claiming that, oh, I am the sole arbiter of my reality, very solipsistic, nihilistic point of view, where that also is magical thinking that escapes the responsibility of being in a world with other people. So there's a lot of little traps amongst this, but I think it's pretty evident and clear that none of us here walking this earth are God on earth. So to have something to strive for as far as our ethics, our morality, our spiritual connection, something beyond us, is, in my opinion, we can't do without it.
Yeah. And isn't it also interesting that Jordan Peterson, who's a famous psychologist today, also wrote a book on this, right? Like We Who Wrestle with God. Are any of you guys familiar with that book and some of the arguments that he's making? Is it similar to what Dung is making here?
I think there are some similarities. I know that Jordan Peterson appreciates Jung's work very much. He talks about it quite a bit. He also has become quite friendly with, I mentioned before, the Pajot brothers, Jonathan Pajot, who was Orthodox Christian. And there's been a lot of dialogues between them regarding this relationship between a religious God and something beyond that, that maybe Jung here is referring to, between the two of them. A lot of interesting conversations, but it seems to me that Jonathan Pajot has been more opening to understanding a little bit more of what Jung may be saying insofar as psychology and our collective psychology. And whereas Jordan Peterson may be influenced slightly by Jonathan's work and is starting to really understand the connection and some of the similarities between psychology and Jung's work with some of the Orthodox Christian views or some of the principles there. But I think the important thing is that if we become very imbalanced in either way, we're missing the mark. Health is coherence. It's an understanding of the whole, right? So I think that's, the important thing is when we're giving all of our sovereignty over to something beyond us and it's magical thinking and we're just in a spiritual realm devoid of our responsibility here, that's imbalanced. If we're just materialist, devoid of anything beyond us, we're imbalanced. And I think that's the relationship we're seeing playing out between the war on consciousness and technocracy.
Yeah. See, what I find fascinating about these quotes is he's saying the religious experience is necessary, although it's irrational. Like he's saying it's irrational, but it's still necessary. And so he's basically detailing that masculine and feminine at a balance because he still likes the rational and all the knowledge, but he's just saying it's not enough.
So, Corey, are you reading Carl Jung's use of the word religious as more of what I might use the word spiritual?
Perhaps, but in this context, I think, he's not referring to a specific religion.
Yeah, I think the word religion needs a definition because in one sense, religion can be interpreted as from coming from the word religare, to be bound back. And that could imply to an authority, or it could be seen as being bound to the ultimate, divinity of God. And that there's a distinction because not all religions are operating purely in the spiritual sense of the authority coming from the divine. Oftentimes the authority is still in the structure of humans claiming a false authority within this structure of religion. So to me, that needs to be clarified.
Yeah.
It's actually both. It's the same with spiritual too.
Mhm.
So it's that again, just like if we just understand there's two sides of every coin, there's a balance point that can be struck with both sides. Because I know a lot of spiritualists who don't necessarily claim that they're religious at all, but
Yeah.
they are in the most of magical thinking and are totally irresponsible for their physical experience in insofar as things like the New Age. So I think that, there can be ways of connecting to source and God, even if it's called spiritual, even if it's called religious, that can be more healthy. But then we have to be very mindful of that which is not, and who's ruling, and where is the attention going? In what end of that spectrum are we putting the attention in? So,
Yeah. Leslie, great point though you mentioned though, is like, can we define it and get more specific? If you look at the works of Carl Jung or people like Jordan Peterson, they're talking about every religion. They're not just talking about like one particular, they're talking about all of them and the different mindsets that go on. And like Stephanie said, there's that Eastern religious and Western religious point of view. Well, why not learn from both? That's why I love the work that these individuals do, studying it and relating it to psychology, which, psyche means soul. And that sounds like a rather spiritual concept, right? And some of these guys have had very spiritual experiences early on in their life that you can say influenced some of their writings. And their writings are deeply profound in numerous amounts of ways, which I think is why some of the spiritual aspects of their work gets attacked, but it's also why I think it has perhaps some value that we're not getting from that mechanical Western scientific purely rational world. So, yeah.
one thing is just like religion, spirituality. I mean, I know many people who can't define spirituality. If you say, what is spiritual?
Yeah.
They can't define it, or they have their own definition.
Mhm.
So I think it's, again, important to realize that we need to be clear about what we mean. And in terms of seeing the broader whole and how this is all interconnected, and the Eastern philosophy versus what we have going on here. And again, I think the most important thing to ask yourself is, are you being led by your lower nature and your unconscious ego, or are you truly seeking innocence and curiosity? Are you really seeking to understand? Are you seeking to have a deeper relationship with the transcendent, but still live here on earth? Like I think in terms of this, we realize that we're all learning. We all have a lot to learn. And one thing I just wanted to mention about, you mentioned the spiritual, the metaphysical experiences or the mystical experiences that a lot of these psychologists have had. There's another guy named Emanuel Swedenborg who I fancy very much. And he was a scientist up until his early 60s. And then he had several very mystical spiritual experiences, and hence wrote like countless volumes of really amazing information on what he calls the afterlife. And I just absolutely love him. I rate him just as high up there with my affection for Jung. And basically he says that to be given a mystical experience is to open your perception of reality beyond that which you already understand. It's not because you're gifted or you're supposed to connect to finding more mystical experiences as a source of being connected to the transcendent by being out of your body. And that's one thing very interesting in the terms of, using psychedelics for health and healing, is that, again, two sides of the coin. Is there an ability to use psychedelics in a way, or psilocybin, to get people out of depression or off of other substances? But then again, are we just seeking that next adventure in your ayahuasca trip because now you're addicted to the transcendent and you think that is the highest reality? You're again out of balance. So all of this work for me, I really appreciate the Taoist philosophy and a lot of the the basic fundamentals of the yin yang and the relationship between the healthy feminine, masculine, right, left hemisphere of the brain, and to understand the imbalances, to be able to recognize the imbalances, to be able to recognize that you can't see your own imbalance, and that usually it requires a powerful mirror to show you that which you cannot see within yourself, and then to swallow your own medicine and to do the work to try to understand both of these principles, which is a life's work, and sadly, many people don't have time to do that kind of work. That's why, things like this and introducing ways to help people tap in to this understanding in a more structured way, I think is going to be very helpful as we proceed forward.
Yeah, I think another way of framing this is the balance between the materialism and the spiritual, seeing that a human being is both material and spiritual. We are this amazing, mysterious being that has access to the divine while living in a physical body, and that we can't live fully in one extreme or the other. But that if we are overly materialistic, then we are in danger of losing the value of our own humanness and this magic and mystery of our existence. So that to really know that, one must recognize that spiritual nature as well.
Hmm.
This is why so often the feminine has been under siege, or we had the witch trials or whatever, because the nature of the feminine body and her connection to her senses, and to deeply be empathetic and to connect with nature in that spiritual way, because she tends to be more able to sometimes connect because of just the nature of her physical embodiment, has been seen as a threat, because that connection to the spirit changes the angle of the direction in which the objective runs the physical, the matter-based reality. She brings in change. She ushers in higher visions of potential and reality that threaten the codependence of the current systems that capitalize off of our disempowerment. So that's why the salvaging and understanding of the healthy feminine energy versus the subversive, unhealthy feminine that's seen as the empowered boss bitch, and we don't need men to create a healthy society. This is not the healthy variation that we're seeing played out in society. So again, educating ourselves and then creating models so people can actually understand what it means to be a healthy, balanced female or male versus that which the society is propagating for their own benefit, or the state or the government.
Yes. And of course, talking about the state like the church as an institution, it can function a lot like the state, as Leslie mentioned, but you can see it as a voluntary structure as opposed to the government, which is more involuntary. But if people have a religious conviction where they believe they are right and everyone else is wrong, and that should lead them to go to war, then they will use the church as a means for the state. So something just to bear in mind, because we've seen that in history quite a lot with crusades and jihads, etc.
But also keep in mind, over COVID, something very fascinating happened, was that the churches were standing up against the state. And a lot of churches were saying, we're staying open. And they took that hit of being closed down, their church being raided, because they had that belief system that, God was above the state. So again, there's just so much more nuance being revealed that it's good to pay attention to.
Right. And religious exemptions too, right? To certain things people would use. Say, hey, I have a certain religion, I practice this, so I don't want to be messed with, And of course, the founding fathers in America, some of them were rather religious, at least from what it seems. And so that freedom of religion idea was like to say, well, regardless of anything else that happens, let us practice our own spiritual exercise.
But in the hospitals, most of the hospitals did not, they didn't permit the religious exemption. So they were saying, no, government and us over your, belief system. So very interesting.
Yeah, that was true in the workplaces as well, in the medical centers, that, the one lost the right, to claim a spiritual exemption or religious exemption to not take a shot or not wear a mask or, other actions.
I mean, just see how direct Carl Jung is here with these quotes. The state has taken the place of God. That is why, seen from this angle, the socialist dictatorships are religions and state slavery is a form of worship. I mean, just go back to 1940s and just see how people worshiped those figures that were put in power, and people loved them. People loved them, absolutely. I mean, they would do anything for them because they did everything that the people wanted. And so I fear that when I see a good politician go on TV or say things that people want or propose good measures, quote unquote. I see this. I see the psychological pattern, but a lot of people do not because they're the ones doing the worshiping. They're the ones in that mentality. And so I'm like, whoa, this is why the psychology is so important for people to understand. Like everyday people, not just physicians, but can physicians help that process in their patients? I think so. Asking questions, getting them curious, finding out that intuition, inspiring that conscience. So Young says free opinion is stifled and moral decision ruthlessly suppressed on the plea that the end justifies the means. Again, that's collectivist type of thinking. Even the vilest of ends are, and means are done. And so the policy of the state is exalted to a creed. The leader or party boss becomes a demigod beyond good and evil, and his votaries are honored as heroes, martyrs, apostles, and missionaries. I mean, do we not see this in the world today? Regardless of your political standing, how people treat both sides and every side in politics with increasing fervor. As things get worse and worse in the world, people become more desperate and they attach more to their authority figures.
And let's notice here how the entertainment industry is now merging with the state as their spokespeople. So as we said before, the entertainers are now advocating for things or the voice of the state.
Yeah.
As well as our, sports heroes and so forth.
And they're gullible, a lot of them. Like I follow, there's different streamers I follow who are rather young in their 20s. Like Aiden Ross spoke to Donald Trump, and did a stream, and everybody was like, whoa. And most of his followers are like 17, 18. Some of them can't even vote. It's like, but this is molding young minds. And he's like, oh my gosh, I get to speak to the president. I get to shake his hand. It's like, what's going on here? Like they really look up to these people. And like if I met Carl Jung or any of these guys, I'd be excited, but I would never say, "Oh my gosh, they gotta be president and rule over me, and they have the right to make laws and decide my life." I mean, I would just say I respect them for their wisdom, and I'd like to meet them, for that wisdom. But it's like, the way people treat their leaders, how far are they willing to go? And so Young says only the party boss who holds to the political power in his hands can interpret the state doctrine authentically, and he does so just as suits him, right? Because he is the state. I am the state. So statism revolves around that person that is put into the state or the government, whatever you want to call it. And he says the performance of a magical action gives the person concerned a feeling of security, which is absolutely essential for carrying out a decision, because a decision is inevitably somewhat one-sided and is therefore rightly felt to be a risk. A magical action, right? It's not interesting because usually religion is associated with like magic and sorcery. Well, what is the state doing, proposing these utopian dreams of you will get this, you will get that. And if you elect me, this will happen. And let's do this certain ritual of certain parades and bands and all this inauthenticity. Is that, taking on that role? Perhaps. He says the suggestive parade of state power engenders a collective feeling of security, which, unlike religious demonstrations, gives the individual no protection against his inner demonism. So, a sense of security. The state, like the church, demands enthusiasm, self-sacrifice, and love. And if religion requires or presupposes the fear of God, then the dictator state takes good care to provide the necessary terror. The fear of God, the fear of the state, right? Fear is, again, used as a means for control and starting that whole process we detailed of mass psychosis. Worldly promises about freedom from care for one's daily bread, the just distribution of material goods, universal prosperity in the future, and shorter working hours. These are all promises that the state provides for people. And notice, the goals of religion: deliverance from evil, reconciliation with God, rewards in the hereafter, and so on. These are parallels to observe. There's even pictures we showed before, different parallels between the systems, all different governments, and how they take pictures of certain figures. They put the sun behind them. They start, putting them in positions of seats where it looks like a church, right? And they have like that strong background behind them, a lot of red, like big chairs, and feng shui that usually represents like, hey, I'm in a power position, the command position. He's talking about the ethical decision of the individual human being no longer counts. What alone matters is the blind movement of the masses, and the lie has thus become the operative principle of political action. So they draw their conclusions from this as the existence of many millions of state slaves completely deprived of all rights mutually testifies, right? Jung was alive during a lot of these different casualties happening all throughout the world with, Hitler and Stalin and Mao. I mean, there were so many of these different figures, all sharing totally different ideologies, some of them directly opposed to each other, yet all of them resulting in democide, right, which we detail as the top cause of unnatural death. And I mean, you just see this goes on. He says, where the many are, there is security. What the many believe must, of course, be true. What the many want must be worth striving for and necessary and therefore good. In the clamor of the many, there lies the power to snatch wish fulfillments by force. Sweetest of all, however, is that gentle and painless slipping back into the kingdom of childhood, into the paradise of parental care, into happy-go-luckiness and irresponsibility. So again, that childness is being played on. People have those internal needs of a mother or father-like figure within their life. And so he says the balancing of accounts is left to a higher political or social authority, which welcomes the task, for its power is thereby increased. Every time somebody says, hey, I want to give away my power, they're going to accept it. They're going to welcome it because it gives them more power. It lets them do more.
Corey,
Yes.
I just wanted to mention on that last slide regarding falling back into the kingdom of childhood. And one thing that you see more than ever, and living here in Texas, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but my phone is constantly alarming with abductions of children. And, one thing that seems to happen is the actual hijack of the purity of the innocence of children. When we're so dysfunctional like this and we go into these childlike states, somehow in order to, find the balance within or collectively, we end up really abusing and neglecting the purity and innocence of our children. And we've all heard horrific stories of abduction and ritual sexual abuse and rapes of children, and even things going on with, the Puff Daddy scandal and things, to get fame, this is what I have to do to you, sodomy and rape. And I mean, it's just disgusting when we're not adults, what we'll do to the purity of children.
Yeah. And, why is that? Is there a trauma we haven't faced? Is there certain things? It's insane. It really is. Using force on innocent people, the most innocent of type 2, can be looked out for. And that trust and that innocence is often played on the most for these power positions. People trust and look up to these different authority figures, like they will do good for me. They sound just like me, And meanwhile, that is the primary danger, is the fact that people are so willing to follow that.
Corey, real quick, even as the child gets older, even the government manipulating, you see this a lot, young adults, teenagers and young adults, even of voting age, where their brains aren't even fully developed yet. I think they say like around 25 is when the brain fully develops. And when you see all of this emotional response with the political agendas, getting these late teens, early 20 activists all riled up and emotional, they're using their state, their naivety and their emotions for their own agenda.
Yeah. And so Jung says you can take away a man's gods, but only to give him others in return. The leaders of the mass state cannot avoid being deified, and wherever crudites of this kind have not yet been put over by force, obsessive factors arise in their stead, charged with demonic energy. For instance, money, work, political influence, and so forth. I find that so fascinating. He refers to money, work, political influence, and so forth as demonic energy, right? And I can see why people then attack Jung and say, "Oh my gosh, he's getting into the metaphysical, transcendental here." But how does that affect people's psyche? You know, money and work. I mean, I'm sure money should be relatively known, but yet who's asking for money? A lot of religions, right? A lot of churches. What's going on there? He says, when any natural human function gets lost, i.e., is denied conscious and intentional expression, a general disturbance results, basically telling us the importance of freedom. Am I wrong? Continuing here, we're talking about the true believer. You know, are we putting our faith in God or are we putting our faith in the governments, as Carl Jung has been talking about? Well, here we have Eric Hoffer, the author on the nature of mass movements. And he says all mass movements generate in their adherents a readiness to die and a proclivity for united action. All of them, irrespective of the doctrine they preach and the program they project, breed fanaticism, enthusiasm, fervent hope, hatred, and intolerance. All of them are capable of releasing a powerful O of activity in certain departments of life. All of them demand blind faith and single-hearted allegiance. And so we have to ask ourselves, when we are creating a change and we're falling to perhaps a new ideology or a new way of thinking, are we really going to move forward with that in a flexible, open-minded way, or are we going to bring that into hatred or intolerance? And he's saying a lot of these mass movements, you know, all of them that he has seen has tend to go into this direction. Are we ready to do what it takes to create a change? This is a question for you. And what comes with that change, right? And how is that process manifest? Well, he explains why people fall to mass movements. One is a desire for change and discontent. He says, for men to plunge headlong into an undertaking of vast change, they must be intensely discontented, yet not destitute. And they must have the feeling that by the possession of some potent doctrine, infallible leader, or some new technique, they have access to a source of irresistible power. And we might even see like different technologies or different medicines, different drugs, right? This is the solution. This is something that everybody must use. And so he says they must also have an extravagant conception of the prospects and potentialities of the future. Finally, they must be wholly ignorant of the difficulties involved in their vast undertaking. And then two, so after the desire for change and discontent is the desire for substitutes. A mass movement, particularly in its active revivalist phase, appeals not to those intent on bolstering and advancing a cherished self, but to those who crave to be rid of an unwanted self. Mass movements are usually accused of doping their followers with hope of the future while cheating them of the enjoyment of the present. Yet to the frustrated, the present is irremediably spoiled. Comforts and pleasures cannot make it whole. No real content or comfort can ever arise in their minds but from hope. All forms of dedication, devotion, loyalty, and self-surrender are in essence a desperate clinging to something which might give worth and meaning to our futile, spoiled lives. So we're trying to find meaning, purpose, hope within our lives. And perhaps that's why we're falling to this mass movement.
You know, Corey, I found it interesting, this dual state, one of dreaming or wishful thinking, this sort of hopium that people are guided to follow, and how that reflects a certain state of discontentment, right? But then what it involves is, or requires for it to become fanatical, is to be disassociated from the present reality, right? Is what it's saying. So it's avoidant of the truth, and that's using denial and avoidance. So there becomes this separation and compartmentalization and conflict.
Yeah, I would like to just add to what Leslie was saying is it's easier to have hope for something new in the future than to turn around and refinish, refurbish, course correct something that's been done in the past.
It's like we were talking about before we started recording, is that we need to focus on the problem. We need to identify it. This is to start where we are, and we need to assess that with open eyes, and shine the light. So,
and how did we get here?
Yeah, how did we get here, and what's the reality that we're starting from? Otherwise, how do we set the goals in realistic ways?
Right. Yeah. It reminds me of what we talked about before. We looked at some of the cycles throughout history. Well, if he's observing the nature of mass movements, clearly there might be some sort of cycle or continuation of some sort of trauma that may be perpetuating or desire that keeps reappearing. And so people are desiring something new, not realizing that's not something new, maybe that was desired. Maybe this same exact desire has been desired before, and it's simply reappearing.
Yeah, repeating history.
Right. And so 3, he mentions is interchangeability. He says when people are ripe for a mass movement, they are usually ripe for any effective movement and not solely for one with a particular doctrine or program. Migration in the mass strengthens the spirit and unity of a movement, and whether in the form of foreign conquest, crusade, pilgrimage, or settlement of new land, it is practiced by most active mass movements. And of course, a lot of the examples he just shared right there are usually forms of authority involved, right? I mean, foreign conquest, crusade, these are all usually formed around some sort of authority who brings these people together. A lot of people are looking up and worshiping that individual figure. He says the superior individual, whether in politics, literature, science, commerce, or industry, plays a large role in shaping a nation, but so do individuals at the other extreme, the failures, misfits, outcasts, criminals, and all those who have lost their footing, or never had one, in the ranks of respectable humanity. The game of history is usually played by the best and the worst over the heads of the majority in the middle. Wow. Think about that. I mean, who are the ones prone to action, right? I mean, I would say it tends to be these extremes because they're not perhaps balanced or content or in that middle, we may say. And not to say that everybody in that middle maybe knows where they are going.
It's like the middle class can get lost.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and healthcare, I think, is a good example, actually, of access. The middle class sometimes is left out of the programs that help the more impoverished, but they're totally opted out of the interventions that the rich can afford, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's funny, Leslie, that you said that. It also reminded me on a more micro level of just the family dynamic in the middle child, as opposed to the firstborn or the youngest child. It seems like the middle child is that one that we tend to overlook amongst an extreme of the beginning and end kind of thing.
Yeah, and they're often the workers too, the productive ones.
That may be something that you can add to our drama triangle, right? Our patient, provider, and system, right? And then expanding more on that patient, the child, and what consisted within them, right? We can break that down and then say, well, where's the feminine and masculine in them as an individual, and then each part of that, definitely.
People are ripe for a mass movement. That they're going to fall for or be ripe for any effective movement. And it just reminded me of most jobs I've had where we're basically being given a solution that is coming through some channel, whether it's like a research-based program that's being imposed on us or taught to us by the government, that they've selected, right? So they're kind of saying, yes, this is what's effective. This is your solution. Look, it's research-based or whatever, or we're doing this study and we want to check out this great new program. But it very much isn't about creating the solutions from within on an individualized local level.
Yes.
Yeah, Leslie, it's almost like they're always continuously running off of whoever has the perceived authority in the collective conscious.
Yeah.
Rather than really, individually seeing where people are at and pushing the needle. That's why I believe in what we've experienced over the last couple of years in this experience of time feeling sped up for a lot of people or unusual. And for me, I've noted several times to several people that it feels like very quickly, although it wasn't quickly, that medicine became very many years behind. Like where they're at currently seems to the outliers, the other extreme of like in your insularity, where you think research is most pioneering on the outside, people have been talking about and doing this for the last 5 or 10 years, but they have the inability to see it because they've been so insulated in whoever is the perceived leader in that realm is following the collective consciousness, and everybody outside of it is going beyond that.
Right. It's a good point. And you know what you guys are talking about, he's here talking about the nature of mass movements. We're adding on to it with a lot of the insights that we see from the other authors. So bear that in mind. When he's talking about mass movements, that's one topic among many other things that we've been addressing, like the nature of authority, which he does not necessarily go into. So when you compound these ideas together, we start to get a bigger picture of what's really going on here. And so he talks about how unity can actually breed division. He says even the mass movements which rise in the name of freedom against an oppressive order do not realize individual liberty once they start rolling. So long as a movement is engaged in a desperate struggle with the prevailing order or must defend itself against enemies within or without, its chief preoccupation will be with unity and self-sacrifice, which will require the surrender of the individual's will, judgment, and advantage. According to Robespierre, the revolutionary government was the despotism of liberty against tyranny. Wow, right? So all these attempts throughout history to reclaim, our freedom. Oh my gosh, it just tends to perhaps create an even worse possible tyrannical government afterwards.
Corey, I just want to say too, in regards to where we're at now in this slide and the last two is when you stress somebody enough or a collective enough, they are so desperate for some sort of change or hope that literally it's almost like they'll fall for anything because anything that they've believed in before clearly hasn't self-realized itself in terms of statism or the government solution or whatever it may be. So that's what we've seen is we've been consciously, I believe, put under an extreme amount of duress and stress. And under those conditions, you're going to find more and more people willing to say, yes, I want change and revolution. I don't know where we're going, but let's go.
Yeah. And of course, within this is also projection and people trying to find out, the things that they're missing within their own life. We talked about that before, some of the childishness that's coming out as well. So there's a lot deeper within this, but absolutely credible points you just made. And so he shares with us the cause of revolution. He says the cause of revolution in a totalitarian society is usually a weakening of the totalitarian framework rather than resentment against oppression and distress. He says the responsibilities and uncertainties of an autonomous existence weigh and prey upon him. He longs for certitude, camaraderie, freedom from individual responsibility, and a vision of something altogether different from the competitive free society around him. And he finds all this in the brotherhood and the revivalist atmosphere of a rising movement. So what I just mentioned, right? If there's that projection, we're looking for something, maybe we're looking for some sense of community because we're missing perhaps our own family. Maybe we can find that within these different movements, these different political ideologies. He shares with us the problem of boredom and scapegoating. He says there is perhaps no more reliable indicator of a society's ripeness for a mass movement than the prevalence of unrelieved boredom. When people are bored, it is primarily with their own selves that they are bored. And this is interesting to me. Of course, we talked about before technology and that interface that technology creates for people. Well, right, we see often that people are scrolling and scrolling on TikTok or different social media, and they tend to go to this when there's nothing else going on, right? So maybe that is a sign of some boredom occurring. He says fervent patriotism as well as religious and revolutionary enthusiasm often serves as a refuge from a guilty conscience. So instead of addressing our internal problems, we want to reach and attach ourselves to these different forms of enthusiasm to help us lift our spirits. And so, more on doctrine, he says the technique of fostering a readiness to fight and to die consists in separating the individual from his flesh and blood self and not allowing him to be his real self. This is a common theme we tend to be noticing, is this idea of the real self versus this inauthentic fake self. And he says this can be achieved by the thorough assimilation of the individual into a compact collective body, very much in line with what Carl Jung mentioned with collectivism. He says by endowing him with an imaginary self, a make-believe self, by implanting in him a deprecating attitude toward the present and riveting his interest on things that are not yet, by interposing a fact-proof screen between him and reality, which we can call doctrine, and by preventing, through the injection of passions, the establishment of a stable equilibrium between the individual and his self, which we can call fanaticism. So there he just broke down doctrine and how that turns into fanaticism, and how the individual is no longer an individual when he's in this collective mentality.
I think I want to relate it to like the medical system and how, these identities become our role, like a role of I'm a doctor, I'm a nurse, I'm licensed, and I'm going, in order to represent myself in this way, I'm following this doctrine that's being given to me by the experts, right? And it takes this whole another layer above, like, well, who am I really? If you take away these roles and these identities, who am I really?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's why he actually calls it quite primitive, this type of, attachment. He says this is undoubtedly a primitive state of being, and his most perfect examples are found among primitive tribes. Mass movements strive to approximate this primitive perfection, and we are not imagining things when the anti-individualist bias of contemporary mass movements strikes us as a throwback to the primitive. When we're curious, like, how could all these people go on a crusade and kill each other? How could all this death happen and all these people suppress their conscience? We start to think, wow, that's crazy. We were just totally primitive and naive and ignorant. These are some of the things we may look at history and say, wow, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, all these guys, they were all wacko and crazy. But at the time, a lot of people clearly did not think they were crazy or wacko at all. People thought that was actually a perfectly necessary mentality to have to help the current world. And so they were looking up to them and their movement and the ideology. Maybe not even for what the ideology even represented, as Eric mentioned, just for the fact that they were seen as an authority figure and reputable, people followed them. And so he says, dying and killing seem easy when they are part of a ritual, a ceremonial, dramatic performance or game. That should be quite revealing here.
Yeah.
Right. In terms of psychology, this concept of stepping up to die and death, I believe that this desire for self-sacrifice can be misconstrued, or even like something like suicidal ideation, with actually on a deeper level, the ego's desire to die to a part of itself, and it becomes misconstrued as the entire entity, when it's really just a calling for a specific part of the individual to die or to be integrated. But because we don't recognize it, it's like we mistake it with our entire individuality.
Yeah, what struck me in this slide was this idea of creating ritual based on belief systems, right? And then promoting unity on belief systems that then create an identity And you can wear a special uniform and have special privileges and feel important based on these associations, right, to your value in a society or so forth. And it's a story. And so I think it's interesting if we think about, well, where did these stories come from? And if we strip them away, what's really true and real? I don't know. Going a little deep here.
Right. Right. Well, we talked about before too how some of this stuff is reappearing through the generations. So if we have some of that primitive part still within us, we probably shouldn't be that surprised. And according to a lot of the scientific and evolutionary models, we came from apes, we came from monkeys, we came from a very primitive state of being. So, if that is true, in case that, we want to accept that premise, then we would say, yeah, we probably still have a lot of that primitive part inside of us, that instinctual part. But are we going to let that lead our decisions and our actions in this life?
Yeah. It's about culture.
I'm feeling here that where we are currently and with the advancements that we have made and the connections to advancements that we have is that we're moving from this state of instinct to consciousness. And it seems to me when we talk about collectivism and community or tribes or groupthink or mentality is that I feel like we're being called to individually do our own work, to have an understanding of true embodiment and understanding of our own roots, our own traumas, where we've been. So then we can align with a group and a collective of people that are in line with developing conscious awareness. Whereas it almost seems like before we just adhered to certain groups or dynamics to be part of something without the consciousness behind it. And what is this group really? Who am I really? Like we just identify with the group before we identify with ourselves. So it seems like the calling would be to, well, hold on, let's create conscious environments by first individuating and become conscious ourselves rather than just saying, I'm a part of this group of people, when many people are peppered within these groups who are completely unself-aware. And we see that a lot with current leadership. Even in the medical system, some of the predominant people who are running our world and our systems are clearly not in a state of individuated conscious awareness. But because they're in a system and they have a degree or a label or a white coat, they presume authority. And I think that the time that we're in is demanding and calling for, if you do not embody conscious awareness and you take your insights from primitive to conscious awareness, you're not going to be able to hold that position, or it's going to get very toxic as consciousness tries to work its way in to those system dynamics.
Along those same lines, what Stephanie was talking about, we see a failure of inner work is a thread that weaves through all the last few slides. The guilt, the boredom, because inner work tends to straighten out the individual and validate the individual and strengthen the individual. And when you have people who have not confronted the inner work or had the opportunity to do it, what you'll have is people with a need for some sort of substitute because they couldn't or didn't do the inner work. The group is going to provide an identity, a substitute identity, and all you have to do is join and go along, and you get to be part of something. It's not an authentic identity. It's not true individuality, but it is what the inevitable result of not doing inner work is that you have fragmented identities amongst the population. And one solution to that is going to be some social movement that gives you position, that gives you identity. And as we know from history, it doesn't always work out well.
Yeah.
Great point, Scott. I just wanted to quickly add for anybody who's on this call or listening, or us here individually, a lot of us have done a degree of inner work and spiritual integration to come to that realization. And it's a stark realization when you start to delve in deep, as Scott was saying, and do the inner work over a significant period of time with the right support, you come to a very clear realization of, oh, this is the real world. This is my true self. Like there is a recognition very often that what you have been participating in, maybe for even your whole life, is a false or imprint layover reality, a substitute reality. So
Yes, come to terms with our primitive self and trying to evolve beyond it. Like you said, like there's that consciousness within us that wants to move forward, and it's like, can we change? Can we move past it? We often say we want to return to the Constitution or return to some sort of ideology, or say, oh, communism could have worked, or republic. Well, if we just try this model, it would work. Are we really heading in the forward-facing direction? And are we present? Because, he mentioned too, we can just be thinking about all the future ideals and then we get lost in that perhaps utopian collectivism that Carl Jung was talking about. And then when you're talking about, consciousness and that battle versus instinct, I start thinking about, well, where did religion come in? A lot of people attribute religion to the foundations to humanity, to like evolving us and creating sciences and creating a bunch of different things. Maybe it's because there was an introduction of morals and consciousness, but of course that primitive state of being started to interlink into the religions and the mass movements.
that's what many, certain psychologists, especially Jungians, will identify. What we have now is actually a war on consciousness. Because when people do the inner work and come to a state of individuated conscious awareness within themselves, they operate different and opposed to the reality that's been created that we see now, that really is based off of our primitive instincts and solutions to primitive problems. So the two are having a hard time being in relationship with one another. And I think that's why we're having a lot of the problems that we're seeing in the world today, is because the projection, the unintegrated self of the primitive that's being challenged by the consciousness, instead of turning it and facing inward and doing the work, it's becoming more aggressive externally with wars and fighting and blaming and shaming in the outer world, because that part of them is going to have to die in order to come into the light, so to speak.
I think people cling to the comfort of the safety of what they know, right? And there's a fear of the unknown. And while we learn from the past, we're not wanting to recreate that. Where the future is unknown, it's uncreated, we haven't discovered the potential yet. So we're called to be creators, right? And to create, we need to be open and expanding our consciousness and managing the fear of that unknown, so that it's not a barrier, which I feel like that is for many.
Yes.
Leslie, I just want to say something real quick in a medical relation. I just was on social media yesterday talking to some physicians, asking the simple question is, why has there not been an apology from a lot of what has happened? Not even an apology, but of, hey, there was a lot we didn't know. Or maybe we could have done things slightly different. Like a lot of physicians were questioning, why is it so difficult for somebody just simply to admit we could have done this better, or let's have a public apology or recognition, because so many people are angry, and there's a lot of people that are waiting for some sort of the reconciliation. And the doctor that I was conversing with was, and we were talking and simply stating that a recognition that you could have done better in your expertise challenges almost everything that that person is putting their belief and their expertise into. It's a challenge of their very identity at their core, by saying what I fully believe in could be wrong, or I could have hurt people. And that just can unfurl a whole host of other issues when somebody comes to that realization, I could have harmed people in my field where I have made a vow to do no harm. It can really start to unravel. So I feel like, and this doctor was mentioning, that there's this doubling down, this gripping on to, like, I am not going to admit that we could have done this better, because if I do, my whole identity is risk for collapse.
Wow.
And a lot of people's money too. Yeah.
And lives.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, he's mentioning it here, escapism and cravings, and in line with what Scott was saying too about how we need to do the shadow work. I start to see that as well as a common theme here. He says the desire to escape or camouflage their unsatisfactory selves develops in the frustrated a facility for pretending, for making a show, and also a readiness to identify themselves wholly with an imposing mass spectacle. All mass movements deprecate the present by depicting it as a mean preliminary to a glorious future, a mere doormat on the threshold of the millennium. Right? If we just put these people in camps, if we just pass this law, if we just do this thing, there's this desire that's coming out of people, and we ask ourselves, where is that coming from? He says it is a perplexing and unpleasant truth that when men already have something worth fighting for, they do not feel like fighting. Craving, not having, is the mother of a reckless giving of oneself.
And craving is also rooted, again, in trauma. Trauma tends to take a bite out of our soul. It creates a feeling or a sense of emptiness, whether it's a trauma of loss or a trauma of being completely like in a serious accident. There is a deep sense of loss, and that creates a craving. And underneath even things like dietary cravings, there's almost always traces to some emptiness or trauma that is at the root of that craving. And so in the context of the society or a social movement, as he's putting it, you have people with unresolved traumas who are prone to cravings. And so having a way to give oneself recklessly, as it says in that last statement, is a way of restoring something that in the unconscious is lost.
It mentions here the identity, it mentions pretending. And, we have a lot of different roles in society that we have these expectations for. You're the president, you're the minister, you're the king, you're the queen. And there seems to be quite a bit of here's a show, here's the ritual, here's the outfit that you wear, right? So is that really authentic? Is that really honest? Remember, we asked that question before. Is it safe to be honest?
Well, there's such a affinity for distractions, food, phone, fun, all the dopamine hits, the feel good, and that addictiveness, which is sort of then where the cravings can lead. If you're not regulating and aware, and using discipline and taking responsibility, right?
And they sell us relief. And as human beings, we have to be more consciously aware that relief doesn't equate to sustainable change and transformation. So we have to be willing to take the harder route. Scott, you were talking about diet. In the Bible, it often talks about the ability for fasting to reset the system, to pull yourself away from any craving, any desire, and suffer, so to speak, for a brief time to cleanse yourself out and reprogram yourself, and even reprogram the cells at a certain level of fasting. So wow. This is why the inner work is so important. And the inner work is not fun. It's challenging, but it's going to take you to a more mature human state where you do have the ability to be more consciously present and aware and handle suffering and not run for the easy way out. And then the systems hopefully would stop settling to provide us with the easy way out. That's unfortunately the system that we're in now, is we want an easy way out. So that's what the system gives us.
Yeah.
And what I would add to that is that if you don't like suffering and fasting, the inner work is a route. It's difficult as well, but it's probably not as painful. So it's a good way to head off future suffering and and other not positive responses to trauma and one's own need for inner work.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
Yeah.
When in craving, you're not in the present moment, right? So you're not in full clarity to be able to make fully informed decisions,
Mhm.
right?
And that's
Yeah.
one of the big issues is that you don't know what you don't know. And a lot of people are blind to the fact that they are living in a suffering cycle or relief cycle or craving cycle. And it takes often a 2x4 over the head or sometimes worse for somebody to really start to wake up and for somebody to really look in the mirror and say, I think that this is my responsibility. You know, it can take a lot, and I would love to see I hesitate to use the word a normalization, but at least an awareness to the fact that many of us may be blind to this, and this could actually improve your life a lot if you took the responsible route and decided to do some inner work. But who do you see normalizing or really talking about this anywhere? No education system. I mean, you see it on social media now, which is a good thing. But, usually people don't get to inner work unless they're deeply suffering or, if they tried everything else and it doesn't work, they've hit rock bottom. And in fact, this kind of work would be incredibly beneficial and transformative for our society as a whole, upstream to everybody being suffering and hitting rock bottom.
It sounds to me as if you guys are describing true freedom in all aspects of our life. Not being beholden to a disease, not being beholden to a craving or an ideology taking us down and taking us away from our authentic selves or a trauma. Seems like these breaking away from all these, even food itself, in the case of fasting, is a form of freedom. And when we're given a billion different types of diets of all different types of foods, we're never given the option of maybe no food at all. And maybe just fasting could be a solution. Perhaps because that's the even freer option, not just free on a physical monetary standpoint, but free like from food in general too. Not just money, but food. I mean, money does grow in trees. Food is a form of money, but I mean, both ways we see we can be free in every way.
I think we get in trouble with our ability to navigate the spiritual and the material realm. So we see people that, go to the spiritual side or whatever indoctrination, the new age or whatever, and people take it too far. And then they become addicted to the transcendent. And I think that's the issue. And what we're navigating is, how do we spiritualize matter? How do we live from a spiritual heart in physical matter and have a relationship between the two in a more balanced, appropriate way?
And I would say a good middle path solution to that is, and also back to what Corey said about freedom, is just working to be worthy of your freedom. Because freedom, a lot of people like the slogan, freedom isn't free. And in one sense, in the sense that we're talking about, freedom takes some vigilance and some work. And if it's done right, it avoids a lot of suffering and it makes us worthy of our freedom and able to enjoy our freedom.
Good point.
So that would be the inner work.
And so he expands the effective doctrine. He says the effectiveness of a doctrine does not come from its meaning, but it's from its certitude, regardless of its truthfulness, right? The politician who's very confident, like in their message, I know this is going to help us. If you just elect me, if we just do this one thing. So it must act as if it had already read the book of the future to the last word. Its doctrine is proclaimed as a key to that book. And religious teachers do the same thing. I have the right interpretation. This is how it is. And if we follow this interpretation and this ideology, this is the result. If we follow this science, if the science says if we do this, if we do that, we see this as a trend here among authority figures. The fanatic is perpetually incomplete and insecure, he says. Hatred is the most accessible and comprehensive of all unifying agents. We always look for allies when we hate. He says the most effective way to silence our guilty conscience is to convince ourselves and others that those we have sinned against are indeed depraved creatures, deserving every punishment, even extermination. We cannot pity those we have wronged, nor can we be indifferent toward them. We must hate and persecute them, or else leave the door open to self-contempt. Crazy stuff. I mean, this is right here telling us, what could cause people to want to be so dangerous to their fellow man, and wanting to create nuclear bombs and going all out for war, becoming reckless, as he said.
I mean, could you imagine that all of the atrocity and war, it is a responsibility of our own lack of self-realization and integration, and this projection is just growing into these societal egregores of tribalism that, we're killing others because it's really us within ourselves that haven't faced our own inner work and our own demons within. It's crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of work that I think practitioners can do that they may realize they feel like they can't, right? Perhaps they feel like the political messages of the world and the state is totally outside their control, and that's just for the political realm. But clearly, to me, it seems like as a practitioner, you almost have a duty looking at this to see that if we can help people learn about themselves and their own freedom, that is getting to the root cause of preventing war and devastation from the political game, the political rituals, and the political society.
This also kind of answers the question as to why criminal minds band together and work in gangs or other groups that can take over governments or militaries or other group situations like that. And so it's a form of trauma bonding, although I'm using the word in a way that's not usually used in psychology. The trauma in this case would be the guilty conscience and people seeking to relieve that by having others who will make it okay around them. And then you get a fairly dangerous situation in which a psychotic individual becomes a psychotic group.
Becoming the enemy, he says it is startling to see how the oppressed almost invariably shape themselves in the image of their hated oppressors. Both by converting and antagonizing, he shapes the world in his own image, which, Stephanie said before, we're curators. And how far do we take that, right? Because this concept of authority we can either give to God or ourselves or another man. And how much do we really want to be the creators of this world? It's an empowering thing to say, yeah, we are the creators, but to other people's lives, beyond their self-ownership, beyond morality, to what extent do we do that? Well, he says obedience itself consists as much in the the imitation of an example as in the following of a precept. The more we mistrust our judgment and luck, the more are we ready to follow the example of others. A mistrust of ourselves.
I had a prominent doctor right around the beginning of the pandemic, who's very seasoned in his field, and came to me in all honesty and said, I don't know what to trust. But meanwhile, he was making very big decisions. But I could tell in that moment that he actually was questioning not just the trust of the public voices, but actually the trust in himself, almost like he had lost trust in himself.
And so, are we justifying ourselves for our ideologies and saying, well, I feel justified to do what I have to do. I'm just following orders, perhaps, right? He says propaganda thus serves more to justify ourselves than to convince others. And the more reason we have to feel guilty, the more fervent our propaganda. To obey is then the only firm point in a chaotic day-by-day existence. It is the sacred duty of the true believer to be suspicious. He must be constantly on the lookout for sabotage, right? Spies and traitors, right? Oh, the left, the right, this person, they're out to get us. Oh, look at this person, look what they're doing. The internet is very prone to this kind of drama baiting, right? Constantly on the outlook of who to cancel next, cancel culture, or who's part of this company, who's part of this law. And we tend to also, guilt by association, say that if they're associated with that, thing, that they are automatically somebody worth attacking. And a lot of people get grouped into that.
Yeah. I'm thinking about authority and how the role of authority, being in a place of power, activates those cravings for more power or for things that represent that, more money, wealth, title, attention, and that can activate this sort of like, Lord of the Rings craving for the ring of power. And that when you are that, tipping that with the other end of the scale of mistrusting a mass of people who mistrust themselves, or even the providers now that are mistrusting their own judgment or can't discern between what they're hearing and what they're not hearing. And then, so it makes prime fertile ground for those kind of power hungry, ring bearers to manipulate or guide the outcomes.
When you start to question the shadow, your own shadow, when you start to weed it out, very often the proclivity is for it to get stronger, is to try to react more aggressively to the individual as you're trying to, I don't want to say kill it, but you're trying to address the ego and get it in its right balance. You can often see that it gets worse before it gets better. It gets bigger and angrier and just pushes you into a corner. You have to keep going through it until you really get to the other side. I think that creates more fear in people. It's like when you start to question, you're starting to wake up, you're starting to question. But then often, depending on your environment and things that are incoming, it's like that ego it doesn't want to let go. It doesn't want to collapse. So it actually grows bigger and darker. And that's harder, more work, harder to deal with.
I have personal experience being in a cult in which my job was to be constantly on the lookout for saboteurs, spies, and traitors, where it says that on this slide. And the irony was that I was actively engaged in inner work. So how did I get out of that? Well, for one, and also, engaged in inner work and self-improvement. And so I wanted to become a better person, enact justice, from my position. And so how did that look? Well, as I became more and more honest with myself, I realized there were a lot less. They weren't everywhere, but that they did exist. And there were a lot less than most people would think. And so I began to act on specifics and really make myself look for specifics in what somebody might be up to doing that they shouldn't be doing, and particularly honing in on who it was, not just the group around the person. And I came out of that on the basis of holding myself to those standards of justice and really being honest in my observations, to the point where I began to realize that I was in the wrong group, that that was actively encouraged in the cult, because all cults fall into that trap of looking for saboteurs, spies, and traitors everywhere.
Yeah. It's a good point. And Leslie mentioned Lord of the Rings. Figured to let the viewers know I did a whole presentation on Lord of the Rings and that whole trilogy called Lord of the Rings: Dethroned. And Sauron, who is usually referred to as the evil figure of the films and the books, although there's somebody called Melkor who is above him, is known as the Shadow as well. And within the movies, they talk about this shadow that is often plaguing the land and taking over the conscience of people. And the ring is the ring of power. There's a lot of synchronicities. If anybody's interested in that, I know Jordan Peterson often talks about how a lot of these ideas can be very well conveyed through story and through different fantasy, that through a lot of, like, you can even go to William Shakespeare and the Bible for a lot of these stories, and it can provide quite a bit of wisdom that is hard to find elsewhere. So also, Eric Hoffer says people raised in the atmosphere of a mass movement are fashioned into incomplete and dependent human beings, even when they have within themselves the making of self-sufficient entities. So they have the ability to have self-ownership, to practice, their own autonomy, but perhaps it's not being nurtured, right? They're being brought into that atmosphere of mass movements. What we talked about before, the schooling system, and Scott, mentioned that we can do this internal work. So we'll talk more about, what some of those processes can be and how we can do that.
And I would just say real quickly that the two missing ingredients are love and self-knowledge.
Yes.
And those are the antidotes to the emptiness or the fragmented identity, which makes one prone to this kind of activity.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to add also that, for instance, in a tribe such as the medical system, it is challenging. It's very isolating. Self-work and inner work can be something that is done mostly in private. And when you become more aware and you commit to the inner work, you do feel like a very odd man out in your normal environment, and it almost becomes a threat. So, I have compassion for anybody that is still working within the field, coming to this awareness and really doing the inner work to wake up appropriately to the ways in which they've been misguided or misled in that environment. Because I think at some point when we do wake up, like Scott said, when you start to become aware to the degree where you see that you're in the wrong environment, then that is another huge reality that one must face, especially if that's your primary calling, your job, your income, what have you. So,
yes. And I think as a good example in history that I often share through some of my works is slavery. Not so long ago, about 200 years ago, were there individuals who called themselves abolitionists, and you can call that a mass movement, right? Individuals who did not, a lot of people who did not want war, who ended up going into war. So there was a lot of problems, internal friction within that movement that you can observe from the previous slides and what we talked about. But also you can see this interesting moral conscience and awakening that took place after thousands of years of people starting to challenge something long ingrained. And so I use this quote here to actually opens up my book on this matter by Leo Tolstoy, who's known as like one of the greatest writers of all time, and he's written many different books on a variety of different subjects. He says, no wonder that the slaves themselves who have always been enslaved do not understand their own position, and that this condition in which they have always lived is considered by them to be natural human life, and that they hail as a relief any change in their form of slavery. Right? We talked about before, it doesn't matter the doctrine necessarily that is proposed upon people. People are just looking for a change. People are desperate. They desire it. So he says, no wonder that their owners sometimes quite sincerely think they are, in a measure, freeing the slaves by slacking one screw, though they are compelled to do so by the overtension of another. Both become accustomed to their state, and the slaves, never having known what freedom is, merely seek an alleviation or only the change of their condition. The other, the owners, wishing to mask their injustice, try to assign a particular meaning to those new forms of slavery which they enforce in place of the older ones. This quote was by far one of the best ones I came across on the topic of slavery, based on my study of hundreds of abolitionists and historians and psychologists on this subject. It really just brings a lot of it together, and it's something you definitely have to unpack. But based on what we shared before, basically there's this idea that the slaves don't see their own slavery, and that's very dangerous.
It brings back that idea that what is familiar is safe, and that I think biologically we're wired towards safety and survival. And
Yes.
so that this overemphasis on safety, tipping towards fear, some security fears, which must have roots in historical trauma. You look at your own ancestry,
Yes.
trauma, right? That we are a species who don't know anything different than to follow the leadership of some authority in an organized state system. And so we are so ripe for manipulation and are like fish in the fishbowl that don't recognize that there's an ocean,
Yes.
outside.
And based on my study of the abolitionists, I mean, these individuals were amazing, and they were using, just as Carl Jung said, the God or the religion of God to counter the state. A lot of them were creating their own towns for the Underground Railroad. These were very rebellious, considered radical figures, although they simply wanted to end slavery. Something that nowadays we would consider, perfectly normal in many parts of the world and perfectly fine and natural to not have. But it's radically different from not even 200 years ago and many thousands of years where that's just part of life. So how did we create such a transition morally? To me, this is one of the best examples we have in history. And you can see here, this is a leading pro-slavery advocate named George Fitzhugh, and he's known for coining the term sociology. Now, of course, there were other people who used this term at that time and day, but you can look this up and affirm this. He is one of the first people to ever use this term, and he created a book called Sociology for the South. And he has other books talking about the failure of a free society. He basically believed that there was no such thing as freedom, and that's basically just a construct in the minds of men, and that we are supposed to have slavery. And so notice what he has to say here. With thinking men, the question can never arise who ought to be free, because no one ought to be free. All government is slavery. The proper subject of investigation for philosophers and philanthropists is the existing mode of government adapted to the wants of its subjects? It is the duty of society to protect all its members, and it can only do so by subjecting each to that degree of government constraint or slavery which will best advance the good of each and of the whole.
So he isn't actually wrong when he says all government is slavery. He just is in the idea that government is inevitable. And he doesn't have the idea of cooperation as an alternative. And this also relates to the earlier slide as well. The difficulty of the people in a slavery with transforming to true freedom. And also why all revolutions in the past have just led to a different form of slavery. So how does the transformation happen in a way that all of humanity can get through it? Well, that's a tough question, one of the toughest questions ever. But if you look at the truth that we all have to change within, and that the inner work is part of that whole movement, we do know that no revolution will ever be successful in total freedom or a condition of freedom that we can all enjoy without a lot of inner work being done. It doesn't mean that every single person has to have all of their inner work done. It just means that a critical mass of society has to arrive at knowing the truth without and within, knowing the truth about how things work outside, which is your study of knowledge, and knowing who you are, which is your self-knowledge. And when that happens in a certain critical mass, then yes, we can transition out of slavery, out of the government equals slavery computation. And viewers are going to be wondering, well, how could we do without government? Because a lot of people haven't even taken that into consideration. And well, voluntary organization is the answer to those functions. A lot of the functions in government are going to be needed in one way or another, but they don't have to be coercive. They can be voluntary. So that's the whole idea. There's a big barrier for people in their thinking to get to how do we get to where we are now, which is in kind of an inevitable slavery that we can't escape from, to can we be worthy of our freedom? Can we get along together in a state of freedom? So the answer is inner work, and the answer to that evolution instead of revolution. And evolution's gotten a bad word in general in science. But when we say evolution of our own thinking, our own awareness, our own knowledge, then we're talking about an evolution that might be a better alternative to revolution based on what we're looking at here.
When I hear the word slavery, I think, well, when most people hear the word slavery, I think they think of that extreme, you know, extremely violent slavery that the African Americans, you know, experienced through chattel slavery. And so they really balk at this idea that we're in slavery. And I think that it's because of that extreme, you know, level that was in history that people say, well, what we have is so much better, like don't rock the boat, don't knock it, you know. And I think that attitude comes from fear, you know, fear that, you know, our masters, so to speak, might, you know, tighten the strings and it'll get worse rather than better, right? So that kind of response doesn't come from a place of freedom, doesn't come from a place of knowing that you have power, you know, over your life, right? It's really comes from this belief that there's an authority that is fearful, you know, kind of lurking over, and not wanting to return to the past, right? Instead of being in that place of creativity.
Yeah.
You know?
It really truly requires almost the attainment of a 100% faith-based orientation, and where you're not in fear, that you have conquered fear, that you understand the nature of life, existence, because it would seem to me that almost all of our issues regarding this mentality are based in a root of fear, somewhere, somehow, you know. So to overcome that and to be in a state of trust, of faith in yourself, after doing your own work, seems to be the only way that we can move away from this. Because as long as fear is running the show, we're always going to be enslaved, most likely by other humans.
Or even to material things, right? In
Exactly.
different ways. We can be enslaved to, some people will say, technology, right? It's always taking us over, or to a disease, depending on the nature of what we want to call slavery. In particular, when we're looking at the abolitionists, we're talking about chattel slavery. I just found
Addiction.
this, yeah, there you go. And I just find this to be such a fascinating topic. I mean, this is a big claim to make. And you look at the psychology of this time and era, it's just incredible. I mean, notice here, he's saying the duty of society to protect all its members. Is that not collectivist thinking? Subjecting each to the degree of government. He's telling other people how society and everything should function, and adapting to the wants of its subjects, already saying there has to be some sort of authority that needs to rule over people, and that authority is designated with this particular role. It has to do this, it has to do that, right? So he's making a framework for how society should operate, and saying that freedom is impossible, okay, and that's going to be chaos, and he says a lot of this. I expand on this very much in my work, but I included this because of quite interesting revelations, and we're going to be using that word sociology to often study a lot of the things that we talk about. So seeing its roots can be quite fascinating.
Yeah, can I add, that this phrase, the duty of society to protect, is an interesting one, because it says the duty of society is to protect all its members. And there are a lot of people, very well-meaning people, who would agree with that.
Right.
And I think that this is a statement that has two sides to it.
Right.
And the key point is about this turning a duty into a coercive action or a mandate that is backed up by violence through a man-made law. That becomes a violation of our freedom, our rights to make voluntary choices. But yet, being human and then understanding our interconnectedness lets us know that there's a moral drive, a moral right to protect and help take care of all people, right? To make sure that all people have food and shelter and clothing. But it's coming from a very different place that doesn't require the state or authority or man-made law. It's from understanding right through moral principle that is back through love and care, knowledge
Yes.
and love.
And I mentioned the abolitionists were very close with their connection with God and what they called the government of God. I mean, you can see here he's appealing as well to religion. He says on the title of this book, he wrote, "The thing that has been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done. And there is nothing new under the sun," which is directly from the Bible. So he's saying, well, government has always existed, so it needs to be a part of it. And government and slavery, they go together. They should always exist, which is like a fascinating connection, nonetheless, claim and something to study. I just encourage people to look into it if you come from a historic background.
And when you commit to the inner work and you can find a renewed state of being, there's no duty to take care of your fellow man. It's not a duty. It just the whole philosophy of everything just shifts. It doesn't feel like a duty. You start to just, when you live from the heart and you have a renewed state and you've integrated and you know yourself, it incentivizes the wantingness to do things. There's no want or desire or duty. You just do it because it's the right thing to do.
Right.
It's switching the government from the external to the internal, so that you are a governor of yourself and your own internal monarch, so to speak, that is doing right action, right? Because it's right, not because of a fear of punishment or because someone's telling you to.
Right. There's a desire and an alignment, and it feels open. It doesn't feel constrictive. When you say duty, it feels like, oh, it's something I have to do. It feels almost like my heart closes. But when your heart is truly renewed, you do things in alignment with your heart staying open because you know how painful it is to close your heart.
Yes. And someone I think like George may say that's wishful thinking. We can never reach that point. And I think that keeps us perhaps in that loop. It holds us back from that progress. I mean, just think about this, right? If you come from a psychology background, think about the words he's using here. And his writings are very well written. You can read this yourself and just be like, wow, I agree with a lot of this. That's what makes it so dangerous. You look at a lot of historical texts throughout history and you're like, wow, there's a lot of truth in that. That's why it's precisely how dangerous it is. He says there is no such thing as natural human liberty because it is unnatural for man to live alone and without the pale and government of society. The slavery principle is almost the only principle of government, the distinctive feature of man's social and dependent nature, and the only cement that binds society together and wards off anarchy. The need of law and government is just in proportion to man's wealth and enlightenment. Barbarians and savages need and will submit to but few and simple laws and little of government. The love of personal liberty and freedom from all restraint are distinguishing traits of wild men and wild beasts.
Wow. So he's the leading pro-slavery advocate.
Yes,
Okay.
in 1800s. I know, and it's incredible connection. And coining sociology, which again is a field of study that's often associated with psychology and other fields that we talk about. And so here we have a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., and also taking reference to Kenneth Stamp and his work, because he talks about this in his book, and it's very well written. He says, "We so often ask, what will happen to my job, my prestige, or my status if I take a stand on this issue? Will my home be bombed? Will my life be threatened? Or will I be jailed? The good man always reverses the question. Slavery in America was perpetrated not merely by human badness, but also by human blindness. The way to produce a perfect slave, accustom him to rigid discipline, demand from him unconditional submission, impress upon him a sense of his innate inferiority, develop in him a paralyzing fear, train him to adopt the master's code of good behavior, and instill in him a sense of complete dependence. He who lives with untruth lives in spiritual slavery." And of course, I'm using ... to differentiate different sections that I grabbed information from, but you can read the whole thing if you'd like. I found these to be powerful statements. He says, "This degradation was sanctioned and protected by the institutions of government. Human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually reaching out for some rationalization to clothe their acts in the garments of righteousness. And so with the growth of slavery. The haunting ambivalence, the intellectual and moral recognition that slavery is wrong, but the emotional tie to the system so deep and pervasive that it imposes an inflexible unwillingness to root it out. My goodness, right? This is somebody who's championed for African American rights and for, the rights of all people. Martin Luther King Jr. saying here that people become blind to recognizing what is right and wrong.
Yeah. Well, chattel slavery was legal. It was supported by governments, right? At
Yes.
some time. So this moral relativity, right? And people rationalizing and justifying horrific things, torture,
Yes.
murder, rape, child abuse, right? With some kind of justification in their mind. And you can look at history and see many examples.
The Fugitive Slave Law Act of the 1800s was a perfect example of that. It made it illegal for slaves to run away from their master, and actually gave an award to those who can capture runaway slaves and bring them back to the plantation. So that was a direct assault against the abolitionists, and that happened after the abolitionists started sharing their message through the newspapers. So they used the technology, they used the education as a tool to enlighten the masses. And as a response of that enlightenment, the shadows striked back at them. And they persevered. They came out on top from the moral argument. They used God and they used all the similar resources, but in a very different way. And so they totally reimagined the way we do things. And I find it very fascinating what's being said here. So mental slavery is the most important topic to understand in relation to this subject that I've delved into, and it's been written by many different writers. And the reason why is because this idea of statism is a mentality that people have where they believe somebody should rule over them, right? That there's this authority in man. So mental slavery is very closely related. And here's a quote that we wrote in the book. The condition of unquestionable or self-induced servitude, not being able to reason and think for yourself, is known as mental slavery or internal slavery. It is the condition of mind control or menticide leading to and maintaining physical slavery or external slavery, and therefore it is the root cause to all slavery. Right? Now, I wrote this because this is my book, but I have many quotes from others who support this idea. Martin Luther King Jr. even called it mental slavery. Bob Marley and Mahatma Gandhi and many figures throughout history. You could also refer to the work of Etienne de la Boétie, who talks about this idea of voluntary servitude. And he's one of the early on people who talked about this idea, known as one of the first people to ever discuss statism as a whole in history within about the 1300s. So definitely important just to know a little bit about it. If you want, you can read his text on that. And so we expand on this. We say mental slavery is where freedom is feared and security dependence is embraced. It would be normal for the slave to have a lack of responsibility over their own property as it wasn't recognized and embraced as their own. It instead belonged to their master. Visible violence or physical slavery isn't necessary if the slave complies on their own and becomes convinced of their own slavery and lack of need and freedom. In other words, the individual assumes their property, their life, their freedom, their ownership, their responsibility simply is being a slave. That is their reality, and they cannot see beyond it. Many of the slaves also did not know how to read or write. They were kept away from education because education would make them more enlightened and more free. Quite incredible.
I think that part of this mental slavery is believing in some kind of a class system, or that some people have more rights than other people, or that some people are, more worthy of certain privileges, and I can't do that because I'm not rich. Or so this dehumanization of people from certain populations and creating differentials. And the whole idea of authority is built upon that.
Yes. And just to support, what Scott said before, this government and slavery dichotomy that seems to be connected, you see this all throughout history. The first form of government you see through Sumeria and uh, the Babylonian, area as well, is it's all the foundations we would call of government seem to be correlated in history, the foundations of like institutionalized, organized slavery. So I don't see that as a coincidence based on my study of history and now bringing in the psychology and seeing how there's almost direct parallels, right? At what point do we say these are one and the same? I don't know. But you have even like the pro-slavery advocates saying that it is, right? So, I mean, it's just incredible to see that connection. And you can even see that the excuses that people make for control over their fellow man is parallel between slavery and government, saying it's natural, it has always existed, every society had it. If the people were free, they'd be worse off. All these fears and all these excuses and justifications that keep people in the condition that they are in. It is a position of disempowerment, right? And when we're talking about medicine, there's a naturopathic principle in naturopathic medicine that says doctor as teacher. And that means that the doctor teaches their client or their patient what they need to know for themselves. Very different from the doctor saying, I have all the answers. You got to listen to me, be dependent on me for the answers. So it's a position of empowerment as opposed to disempowerment. And we have to ask ourselves if we are helping others, empowering them, or trying to only feed our egoic selves at the expense of other people's lives and well-being. So here's a bunch of different examples you can look over. And Herbert Spencer, who was alive during this time, I have many quotes from him as well in the book. He was one of the most famous psychologists and polymaths at the time. I mean, he really did studies on many different civilizations and fields that I think, if you're not familiar with Herbert Spencer, definitely open any textbook in the 1800s and you might see his name come up quite a bit. He said, all the barbarisms of the past have their types in the present. All the barbarisms of the past grew out of certain dispositions. Those dispositions may be weakened, but they are not extinct. And so long as they exist, there must be manifestations of them. What we commonly understand by command and obedience are the modern forms of bygone despotism and slavery. To whatever extent the will of the one is overborne by the will of the other, to that extent the parties are tyrant and slave. So the words are changing. Maybe there's euphemisms, there's clothing of the action, like Martin Luther King Jr. said, and we've said it many times before, this idea of pretending and identity and disguise.
The law of equal freedom, quote by Herbert Spencer, psychologist, polymath. As a corollary to the proposition that all institutions must be subordinated to the law of equal freedom, we cannot choose but admit the right of the citizen to adopt a condition of voluntary outlawry. If every man has freedom to do all that he wills, provided he infringes not the equal freedom of any other man, then he is free to drop connection with the state, to relinquish its protection, and to refuse paying towards its support. It is self-evident that in so behaving, he in no way trenches upon the liberty of others. For his position is a passive one, and whilst passive, he cannot become an aggressor. Not only does magisterial power exist because of evil, but it exists by evil. Violence is employed to maintain it, and all violence involves criminality.
Wow. Saying that essentially voluntary outlawry can be justified, right? In regards to recognizing your own freedom and simply standing on that ground because it's equal with everyone else and their freedom. You're not claiming to be more special or less special because you're claiming your freedom. You're claiming everybody's free. So they have the right to do the same thing. Disassociate from you and disassociate from your ideology and the way you think society should operate. He also talks about how we create rights and the importance of that. He says, so alien to the truth indeed is the alleged creation of rights by government that contrives rights having been established more or less clearly before government arises become obscured as government develops along with that militant activity which both by the taking of slaves and the establishment of ranks produces status. The recognition of rights begins again to get definiteness only as fast as militancy ceases to be chronic and governmental power declines. Of course, a huge run-on sentence from the 1800s, no surprise there, but incredible revelation talking about rights in the context of government and rights in the context of freedom from government. Again, God in the context of, supporting government, or God in the context of against. These concepts can be used in two different ways, and we can see why they are created as well. Oftentimes people talk about rights as this thing that they have and that they want, and so that determines then, how they're going to act in the world. Are they acting on behalf of something that they have or that they desire?
It's about hiding abuses under the cloak of rank or status. That's what he's talking about, and how easy that is.
Yes. And that's what he talks about here with disguising the master. He says he feels that a fellow man may be enslaved by imperious words and manners as well as by tyrannical deeds, and hence he avoids a dictatorial style of speech to those below him, even paid domestics to those services he has obtained a right by contract. He does not like to address in a tone of authority. He seeks rather to disguise his character of master. So as, perhaps the master of a plantation recognizes that he wants to further enslave his slaves and get them to enjoy their condition and work harder for him, maybe he changes his demeanor and his way of coming across to them to act like he's on their side. Maybe he says, this is, I'm a nicer master than these other masters. You want to have me on your side. And he starts playing mind games with them to get them to go along with it. And we have to be careful of not doing the same thing as well here, whether for any cause is becoming somebody who we're not and projecting to others and trying to put on a show. He talks about autocracy presupposes inferiority of nature on the part of both ruler and subject. On the one side, a cold, unsympathetic sacrificing of others' wills to self-will. On the other side, a mean, cowardly abandonment of the claims of manhood. Our very language bears testimony to this. Do not dignity, independence, and other words of approbation imply a nature at variance with this relation? Are not tyrannical, arbitrary, despotic epithets of reproach? And are not truckling, fawning, cringing epithets of contempt? Is not slavish a condemnatory term? Does not servile, that is, serf-like, imply littleness or meanness? And has not the word villain, which originally meant bondsman, come to signify everything which is hateful? That language should thus inadvertently embody dislike for those who most display the instinct of subordination, is alone sufficient proof that this instinct is associated with evil dispositions. It has been the parent of countless crimes. It is answerable for the torturing and murder of the noble-minded who would not submit. For the horrors of Bastilles and Siberias, it has ever been the repressor of knowledge, of free thought, of true progress. Isn't that incredible? Talking about the nature of language. Another connection that I mentioned in the book is this idea of the subject and subjugation. Right? Like subjugation is usually correlated with the word slavery. And then we usually refer to citizens as subjects. So it's just, again, is this a coincidence? I don't know. But this is a psychologist telling us about these connections between these words. And there's a lot of people nowadays who they want to get freedom through signing paperwork a certain way and using certain legalese and certain word language, because the words can make an impact on people's perception of reality. So I think this is important to just go over and understand. Of course, we have a lot of technocratic or very technical language in the medical field and within legalese that people don't understand it. And when you start breaking it down, some people call this green language, it starts to raise a lot of questions. And so let's talk about psychiatry, because psychiatry, as I mentioned, in these different fields can use a lot of language And we talked about this problem of classification and identifying diseases and saying, you have this, and so you must have that. Well, organized psychiatry, this is from Dr. Peter Breggin, says it's not meeting the needs of the individual as much as it is controlling the individual in the interest of society in the form of the government or other social interests. The contemporary widespread diagnosing of children is a subtler form of social control that suppresses children rather than providing them with what they need to fulfill their basic needs in the home, school, and family. Instead of reforming our educational system and improving family life, we drug our children into more docile states. For more information about this, he's got a bunch of different books on this, and I, recommend checking it out. But basically, it's insane because if you think about slavery, what we just talked about, one of the ways to keep people under control was through medicine, actually, through health. If a slave doesn't have much possessions and they're not entirely healthy and they can't think for themselves, then they're going to be easier to control. But if somebody is full of strength and full of knowledge, they basically just can't be a slave. Like Frederick Douglass said, once a man learns to read, he is no longer a slave. And he has other ways of saying it too, and he's had shared experiences as well about having better or nicer masters and how he recognized he was still a slave, so it didn't make a difference. I mean, our children are very vulnerable in our society, right? We wouldn't necessarily call them slaves. They're developing. They are going to become someone great and amazing. If we nurture that, if we support that, instead of saying, oh, well, they're docile, they're children, they're meant to be tampered with. Like, this is the mindset some people will have, right? In our world. And we have to be very careful of that because then we're prone to manipulating these very vulnerable people who are going to be the future us. And it's going to backfire on us in our society.
Yeah. And it also goes back to the idea of dehumanizing certain populations, right? Seeing children as lesser, as less than,
Yes.
less valuable. And, and then because children were treated as kind of to be seen and not heard and, workers and so forth, right? What is the mindset? This is the part of the mental slavery, is the belief that they aren't valuable, aren't worthy, aren't important. And when children internalize that very young, and it is expressed in both subtle and not subtle ways and passed on epigenetically to the next generation, right? Leading to willing slaves.
Yes.
And the other thing too is the blatant abuse of a true innocent child and their naivety. Is you can't expect a child to be operating at full functioning left brain capacity for your agenda. So it seems like for some reason we feel as though, well, they're not up to speed, so they're less superior, right? But really, truly, that principle of innocence and naivety and the beauty of a child is one of the most important things we have to foster here on Earth. So.
All right, so we're coming to an end here, and we just want to conclude some of what we have to share in regards to the medical community in relation to some of the freedom-based concepts we've been sharing in psychiatry, where we see the government may have control over different medical choices and practitioners and patients within.
One of the things that strikes me about psychiatry is it is the one field in the medical field that is the most authoritarian and most tied to authoritarian government and has been historically used by government. And we're seeing examples of interfering with the children, getting into the children, forms of social control through psychiatry, which unfortunately psychiatry has a long history of social control. So I think what the last slides have revealed is that the health community, primarily through psychiatry, but in taking a look at itself, can maybe look at how the extent of government and authoritarian government has impinged on that profession, how they may be unwittingly or unconsciously following in the steps of an authoritarian government in the way that they have structured and are carrying out what they think is their duties. So this is a very important point that we've arrived at here, because we just demonstrated that psychiatry has been heavily involved, and it's in the health community, and it influences the rest of health.
Yes.
And so it's worth looking at the analogies between government and the health care community.
And we'll expand on that a lot more as time goes on, as we find out psychiatry, as opposed to psychology, can be quite problematic when it comes to drugs and the control of individuals and classification of individuals. And we'll be sharing different solutions that could also be used, different ways of shadow work, as we mentioned before, as we move on. It's important to note that in the 1800s, there were a lot of doctors and scientists who were proving that certain races were inferior, using science, saying, hey, scientifically, these people are not supposed to be free. And this is something to back up some of the things that Scott was mentioning. Hey, Stephanie, if you want to conclude for us, this is the final slide we have for this part, and basically bring a lot of the ideas we've talked about together, our analysis of state medicine.
Sure, Corey. So we have here pharmaceutical companies are granted government protection to isolate chemical molecules from nature and claim them as their own through patents. We then have to even get a pharmaceutical drug on the market, whether for cancer or otherwise, the drug company that manufactured it must file a new drug application with the FDA. Though it's been on the record since at least the 1970s that cannabis targets and destroys cancer cells, the US government officially regards the plant as being medically useless, which is why it's still illegal at the federal level. The only thing that really differentiates the alternative treatments from the conventional methods, are which most people are familiar, is their recognized status. The former aren't officially approved by government. Lawsuits can drive health policy, what a practitioner can and cannot do. Therefore, healthcare is not always about health. It can be more about a liability. So can we trust the science when there are clear agendas?
And this ties together a lot of what we talked about with freedom, sharing some examples here of cases where people cannot practice freely, or there may be agendas present. And if we don't really address this bigger problem, perhaps, of freedom and autonomy, can we truly expect to see a shift in the health of the world? That's my challenge, my question to anybody in the medical community. So that's it for part 3, everybody, and I really appreciate you for joining us. We're going to delve deeper into some of the different facets of the medical system. And if anybody wants to say any last words, Scott, Leslie, Stephanie, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks
Thank you,
for all
Corey.
you listeners.
All right. Join us for part 4 so we can go more into statistics and examples of statism. We're going to be expanding even deeper into what we have already covered into different facets. Now, you could skip some of these next coming parts if you want to, but if you want a full deep dive, I would recommend that you do follow along with us, because there could be some key points of wisdom in there, certain psychological components that if you don't have that fuller picture, it could be slightly harder to address this mentality we're detailing. Thank you very much for joining us. Go to healthrevealed.org.
Kaylee,
Yes.
you were born April 4th, 1999. Do you believe you were created to be free, or do you believe you were created to be a slave?
I believe I was created to be free.
Okay? Once again, that's what 100% of participants surveyed answer. But I know it's not the reality of their lives. And I know they're never going to be happy unless they create calibration and commitment to the fact that they were born to created to be free. And encourage the people that you love to do the same exact thing. And once again, form a plan as to how you're going to cast off the shackles of your own slavery. Because unless you're willing to cast off those shackles from your false happiness activities, from your slavery activities, you're never going to go through this life being as happy as you can.